In the harsh winter of 1887, the Wyoming Territory was no place for a woman alone, especially one carrying a child. When Sarah McKenna fled her past with nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart full of fear she never expected to find. Salvation in a crumbling homestead at the edge of nowhere. Inside, she discovered something that would change everything. A fever-stricken widower named Jacob and his 2 children, barely clinging to life after weeks without proper care. What started as a simple act of mercy, nursing a dying man back to health, would become something neither of them saw coming. Sometimes the family you need isn't the one you were born into, but the one you choose to save. But what happens when the past you're running from finally catches up, threatening to destroy the only home you've ever truly known? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled across the Wyoming plains like a living thing, carrying with it the bite of winter that could freeze a person's breath in their lungs. Sarah McKenna pulled the threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders, her hands trembling, not just from the cold, but from exhaustion that had settled into her bones over the past 3 weeks of travel. The faded wedding ring on her finger caught what little light filtered through the storm clouds, a reminder of the life she'd left behind in Boston, the life that had nearly destroyed her. She hadn't meant to stumble upon the homestead. The small log cabin had appeared through the swirling snow like a mirage, its windows dark and chimney-cold. Sarah had approached with the desperation of a woman who knew she couldn't walk another mile without shelter. Her pregnancy, now 6 months along, made every step a battle against her body's demands for rest. The door had been unlocked, swinging open with a creak that spoke of neglect. Inside, she'd found them, a man burning with fever, his face gaunt and pale, and 2 small children huddled together on a mattress, their eyes wide with hunger and fear. The little girl, perhaps 8 years old, had clutched a wooden horse to her chest, clearly handmade, with careful attention to detail that spoke of love. The boy, younger still, had buried his face in his sister's shoulder when Sarah entered. Too weak to do more than whimper, the cabin itself told a story of better times. Hand-hewn logs fitted with the precision of a master craftsman, wide plank floors worn smooth by years of family life, and a stone fireplace that dominated one wall with quiet dignity. But now dust covered most surfaces, dishes sat unwashed in a basin, and the cold had crept in through windows that hadn't been properly sealed against winter's advance. Sarah had found the journal quite by accident, tucked beneath a loose floorboard when she'd knelt to tend the fire. The leather cover was soft with age, and the pages within revealed the intimate thoughts of a woman named Mary, Jacob's wife. She'd learned from the tender way his name appeared throughout the entries. Mary had written about her hopes for their children, her dreams of expansion to the homestead, her worries about Jacob's nightmares from his time as a cavalry officer. The final entries spoke of a sickness that had taken hold of her lungs, and her fear of leaving Jacob alone with Emma and Thomas. That had been 3 months ago, according to the dates. 3 months since Jacob had buried his wife in the small cemetery plot visible from the kitchen window, marked by a simple wooden cross that stood sentinel against the endless sky. 3 months of a man trying to hold together a household while grief slowly consumed him from within. Now, 2 weeks after Sarah's arrival at the homestead, Jacob's fever had finally broken. She'd spent those first days in a constant vigil, spooning broth between his cracked lips, bathing his forehead with cool water from the well, and keeping the fire burning through the long, cold nights. The children had watched her with a mixture of hope and suspicion. Hope that this stranger might save their father, suspicion born from too many months of disappointment and loss. Emma had been the first to warm to her. The little girl had helped. Sarah prepared the simple meals, showing her where Mary had kept the preserves and dried beans that would sustain them through the winter. Thomas, barely 5 years old, had taken longer to trust, but Sarah had won him over by repairing his wooden horse, carving new legs where the old ones had broken and smoothing the rough edges with patient care. "You don't have to stay," Jacob had whispered on the morning his fever broke, his voice rough from days of delirium. His eyes, Sarah noticed, were the color of weathered leather, with lines around them that spoke of years spent squinting into sun and wind. "I know you've got somewhere else to be." Sarah had been changing the dressing on a wound along his ribs, an old injury that had reopened during his illness when he'd spoken. Her hands had stilled on the clean cloth, and she'd found herself unable to meet his gaze. How could she explain that she had nowhere else to go, that the life she'd fled in Boston held nothing but shadows and the memory of her husband's fists? That this cabin, with its smell of wood smoke and the sound of children's laughter beginning to return, felt more like home than anywhere she'd ever lived. "The children need someone," she'd said instead, her voice barely above a whisper. "At least until you're back on your feet." Jacob had studied her face with the intensity of a man accustomed to reading people quickly and accurately. Sarah had felt exposed under that gaze, as if he could see through the careful walls she'd built around the truth of her circumstances. But there had been no judgment in his expression, only a kind of weary understanding that suggested he, too, carried secrets. "What's your story, Sarah McKenna?" he'd asked, using the name she'd given when the children had asked what to call her. It wasn't entirely a lie. McKenna had been her maiden name, the one she'd taken back after fleeing Boston in the dark of night. The question hung between them like smoke from the fireplace, curling up toward the rafters where Mary's preserving. Herbs still hung in neat bundles. Sarah had felt the weight of the faded wedding ring on her finger, the constant reminder of the man who'd claimed to love her while slowly trying to break her spirit. Charles Worthington III had been everything Boston society admired: wealthy, educated, connected to all the right families. He'd also been a man who believed a wife was property to be controlled, shaped, and occasionally disciplined when she forgot her place. "I'm running from a life that wasn't mine," she'd said finally, the words coming out before she could stop them. "And hoping to find one that is." Jacob had nodded slowly, as if her answer made perfect sense. "Mary used to say that sometimes the best families aren't the ones you're born into, but the ones you choose." He'd paused, his gaze moving to where Emma was teaching Thomas to braid strips of leather by the fire. "She would have liked you, I think." The days that followed had settled into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. Sarah would wake before dawn to stoke the fire and prepare breakfast. Usually cornmeal mush with preserves, sometimes eggs when the hens were feeling cooperative. Jacob, growing stronger each day, would handle the morning chores, feeding the animals, checking the henhouse, splitting wood for the fire. The children would help where they could, Emma proving surprisingly capable for her age, Thomas eager to please despite his small hands and shorter reach. Evenings were for stories by the fire, Jacob's deep voice weaving tales of his cavalry days, carefully edited for young ears, while Sarah mended clothes or worked on the endless task of keeping their small household functioning. Sometimes Jacob would produce a harmonica from his pocket, playing melodies that seemed to ease the tension that lived in Sarah's shoulders, songs that made the cabin feel less like a refuge and more like a home. But it was in the quiet moments that Sarah found herself most aware of the change taking place within her. When Jacob would catch her eye across the room and smile, not with the calculating charm she'd known from Charles, but with simple warmth that asked for nothing in return. When Emma would lean against her while Sarah braided her hair, the little girl's trust a gift more precious than gold. When Thomas would fall asleep in her lap during evening stories, his small body completely relaxed in a way that spoke of security she helped provide. The baby growing inside her seemed to respond to the peace of the homestead as well, where she'd experienced constant anxiety in Boston, afraid that stress might harm her unborn child. Here, she felt a deep calm that allowed her to truly feel the small life stirring within her. Sometimes, when she thought no one was looking, She would place her hand on her rounded belly and imagine a future where this child would know only the kind of love she saw Jacob give to Emma and Thomas. Patient, steady, unconditional. Jacob had begun to show signs of the man he'd been before grief and illness had laid him low. Sarah could see hints of the cavalry officer in the way he carried himself, the quick assessment he made of any situation, the quiet authority that made Emma and Thomas respond immediately to his guidance. There were moments when she caught him, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between gratitude and something deeper that made her heart skip in ways it hadn't for years. The outside world felt very far away from their small homestead. The nearest town, Cedar Ridge, was a half-day's ride in good weather, and winter had effectively cut them off from regular contact with neighbors. This isolation, which might have felt lonely under other circumstances, instead created a sense of sanctuary that Sarah treasured. Here, she wasn't Charles Worthington's runaway wife or the subject of Boston society's gossip. She was simply Sarah, a woman helping a family in need, finding purpose in daily tasks that mattered. But even in this peaceful haven, Sarah couldn't entirely escape the shadows of her past. Sometimes she would wake in the night, heart racing, from dreams of Charles' voice calling her name, demanding she return to fulfill her duties as his wife. The fear that someone might come looking for her was a constant companion, made more acute by her pregnancy and the knowledge that Charles' family would have strong opinions about any child that carried their bloodline. These fears she kept to herself, not wanting to burden Jacob with problems that weren't his to solve. He had his own healing to do, his own children to raise, his own grief to process. Sarah told herself that her presence here was temporary, that once Jacob was fully recovered and spring arrived, she would continue her original plan to travel west to California, where a woman might disappear entirely into the growing populations of the mining towns. But as she watched Emma help Thomas with his letters by firelight, or listened to Jacob hum while he worked, Sarah found it harder and harder to imagine leaving this place. For the first time in her adult life, she felt part of something larger than her own survival. She felt needed, valued, even loved in a way that had nothing to do with duty or obligation. The wooden horse that Thomas treasured, now mended and smooth once again, had become a symbol of this new beginning. Sarah had spent hours on the repair, not just fixing the broken legs, but sanding every surface until the toy gleamed like new. When she'd presented it to the little boy, his face had lit up with pure joy, and he'd thrown his small arms around her waist in gratitude that brought tears to her eyes. Mama Sarah, Emma had started calling her, the name slipping out naturally during a moment when Sarah was braiding the girl's hair. The words had frozen Sarah's hands in place, her heart clenching with a mixture of joy and fear. She'd never expected to be anyone's mother, had barely begun to imagine what that might mean for her own child. But hearing it from Emma, seeing the trust and affection in the little girl's eyes, had awakened something fierce and protective in Sarah's chest. Jacob had heard the exchange and met Sarah's uncertain gaze with a nod of approval that somehow made it official. From that moment forward, she'd been Mama Sarah to both children, a role that felt more natural than anything she'd ever done in Boston's elegant parlors and formal dining rooms. As winter deepened around their small homestead, Sarah began to understand what Mary had written about in her journal, the sense of building something lasting, something worth protecting. The love that filled this cabin wasn't the passionate, consuming fire of romantic novels, but something steadier and more enduring. It was love built on shared work, mutual respect, and the daily choice to care for one another's well-being. Sarah McKenna, who had fled Boston as a frightened woman with nothing but the clothes on her back, was slowly becoming someone she'd never imagined she could be. And for the first time since her husband's death had set her free, she was beginning to hope that the past might stay buried long enough for her to build a future worth keeping. The ride to Cedar Ridge had been Jacob's idea. After 3 weeks, of recovery. He'd insisted on making the trip to town for supplies before the next storm hit, and Sarah had reluctantly agreed to accompany him. The children had stayed behind with old Mrs. Henderson, a neighbor who lived 2 miles south and had been the first to welcome Sarah without questions or judgment. Cedar Ridge was a modest settlement that had grown up around the railroad depot. Its main street lined with the practical businesses that kept frontier life functioning. A general store, a blacksmith, a small hotel that doubled as a saloon, and the post office that served as the town's connection to the wider world. Sarah had kept her head down as they'd made their purchases, allowing Jacob to handle most of the interactions while she stayed close to their wagon. It was at the post office that their carefully constructed peace shattered. Mrs. Sarah McKenna, the postal clerk, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, had looked up from his sorting as Jacob collected their mail. "Got a telegram here for you. Came in 2 days ago." Sarah's blood had turned to ice water in her veins. No one should have known to send correspondence to Cedar Ridge. No one should have known where she was at all. With trembling fingers, she'd accepted the yellow paper, aware of Jacob's sharp gaze as she unfolded it. The words had swum before her eyes at first, her vision blurring with the shock of recognition. Then they'd come into terrible focus. Sarah. "Stop location discovered. Stop family demands return. Stop child belongs to Worthington estate. Stop legal action proceeding. Stop Edmund Worthington." The telegram had fluttered from her nerveless fingers to the post office floor. Jacob had bent to retrieve it, his movements careful and deliberate, and Sarah had seen his jaw tighten as he read the brief message. "Friend of yours?" the postal clerk had asked with the kind of casual curiosity that made small towns both welcoming and dangerous. "Family matter," Jacob had replied smoothly, folding the telegram and slipping it into his coat pocket. "Thank you for holding it." The ride back to the homestead had passed in tense silence, the wagon wheels crunching through snow that seemed to grow deeper with each mile. Sarah had sat rigid beside Jacob, her mind racing through possibilities and implications, none of them good. Edmund Worthington was Charles's older brother, a man whose calculating coldness made her late husband seem almost warm by comparison. If Edmund was involved, it meant the family had decided her unborn child was valuable enough to pursue. "We need to talk," Jacob had said as they'd pulled up to the cabin, his voice quiet but firm. "After the children are asleep." The evening had dragged by with excruciating slowness. Sarah had gone through the motions of preparing dinner, helping with evening chores, and listening to Jacob read to Emma and Thomas from a worn copy of Grimm's fairy tales. But her thoughts had been consumed by the telegram's implications and the fear that her sanctuary was about to be destroyed. When the children were finally settled in their beds, Jacob had built up the fire and settled into the chair across from where Sarah sat on the small sofa Mary had made from feed sacks and careful stitching. The journal lay on the side table between them, its leather cover reflecting the firelight like a watchful presence. "Tell me about the Worthingtons," Jacob had said without preamble. Sarah had stared into the fire, gathering courage from its warmth. "Charles, my husband, was the younger son of one of Boston's oldest families. Banking, shipping, real estate, the kind of wealth that goes back generations." She'd paused, her hand unconsciously moving to cover her belly. "I met him at a charity function. He was charming, attentive, everything a woman was supposed to want in a husband. But Charles believed that marriage gave him ownership, not just of my property or my social connections, but of me. My thoughts, my movements, my very existence." The words had come easier than she'd expected, perhaps because Jacob's steady presence made them feel less shameful. He had very specific ideas about how a Worthington wife should behave, and when I failed to meet his expectations, she'd touched her ribs unconsciously, where old bruises had long since faded, but the memory remained sharp. Jacob's expression had hardened, his hands clenching briefly before he'd forced them to relax. "How did you get away?" "Charles died in a carriage accident 6 months ago, driving too fast in the rain, trying to catch up with me after I'd fled. To my sister's house following a particularly difficult evening." Sarah's voice had grown quieter. "His family blamed me, said I'd driven him to recklessness with my disobedience, but his death meant I was free. Or so I thought. The baby. Charles never knew about the pregnancy. I only discovered it myself after his funeral." Sarah had looked up to meet Jacob's eyes, needing him to understand. "I thought if I disappeared before anyone else found out, I could start fresh somewhere no one knew the Worthington name." Jacob had been quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the firelight. "But they found you anyway. Edmund is thorough and ruthless. If he's involved, it means they've decided the baby is valuable to them." Sarah's voice had cracked slightly. "A Worthington heir, even one born to a woman they despise. What does the telegram mean? Legal action?" Sarah had stood abruptly, pacing to the window where she could see the small cemetery plot where Mary rested. Charles's will probably contained provisions about any children. The Worthingtons don't leave things to chance when it comes to inheritance. She'd pressed her forehead against the cold glass. "They'll claim I have no right to keep the child, that I'm unfit, that the baby belongs with them. And you believe they have grounds for that claim?" The question had hung in the air like smoke from the fire. Sarah had thought about her life in Boston, the servants who'd watched her with pity, the doctor who'd treated her injuries without asking questions, the social circle that had whispered about Charles's temper while doing nothing to intervene. "I have no money, no family support, no social standing without the Worthington name. In the eyes of the law, I'm probably exactly what they'll claim I am. An unfit mother who ran away and is living in sin with a stranger." The words had felt like stones in her mouth, heavy with the weight of truth. She turned from the window, to find Jacob watching her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Is that what you think you're doing? Living in sin? I think I'm surviving. And for the first time in years, I'm doing it somewhere I feel safe." Sarah had returned to the sofa, her exhaustion suddenly overwhelming. "But it doesn't matter what I think. It matters what a judge will think when the Worthingtons present their case." Jacob had leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, hands clasped. "Together. There's something you should know about me, Sarah, something that might change how you see this situation." He'd risen and walked to the mantelpiece, reaching behind a framed photograph of Mary to retrieve a small wooden box. Inside, nestled in faded blue velvet, was a military medal, the Congressional Medal of Honor, its bronze surface dulled with age, but unmistakable in its significance. "I wasn't just cavalry," Jacob had said quietly. "I was an officer, served under General Crook during the Indian campaigns, then later in special operations that required discretion." He'd met her stunned gaze steadily. "I have connections, Sarah. People who owe me favors, people who remember my service. The Worthingtons may have money and influence in Boston, but this is Wyoming Territory, and out here, different things matter." Sarah had stared at the medal, her mind reeling with this revelation. "You never said—" Mary knew. "The children don't. Not yet. I came out here to forget that part of my life, to build something peaceful." His voice had grown rough with emotion. "But if someone threatens my family, I remember real quick how to fight. Your family. Emma and Thomas call you Mama Sarah. You've spent 3 weeks nursing me back to health and caring for my children as if they were your own. That baby you're carrying has been kicking against your ribs while you've rocked Thomas to sleep." Had returned the medal to its box with careful reverence. "In every way that matters, you are family, and I protect what's mine." The declaration had hit Sarah like a physical blow, overwhelming in its simple conviction. "Jacob, you don't understand what you'd be getting into. The Worthingtons have resources, lawyers, political connections, and I have something they don't." "What's that?" "The right cause." Jacob had sat back down, his presence filling the small space between them. "They want to take a child from its mother to satisfy their own greed and pride. I want to keep a family together. In my experience, that kind of motivation wins more battles than money ever does." Sarah had felt tears threatening for the first time since reading the telegram. Why would you do this? Risk everything you've built here? Because 3 weeks ago you walked into our lives and saved us. Not just from sickness, but from the kind of slow dying that happens when people give up hope. Jacob's voice had been steady, certain. Emma's been smiling again. Thomas doesn't wake up crying every night. And I remember what it feels like to want to see tomorrow. The fire had crackled in the silence that followed, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Sarah had thought about the life she'd known. In Boston, the cold elegance, the careful words, the constant fear of saying or doing the wrong thing. Then she'd thought about this cabin, where Emma's laughter rang out freely and Thomas showed her his treasures with complete trust, where Jacob hummed while he worked and looked at her as if she was something precious rather than something to be controlled. "What are you proposing?" she'd asked finally. "That we fight together, that we show any judge or lawyer or fancy Boston family that this is where you belong, where your child belongs." Jacob had reached across the space between them, covering her hand with his own. "That we make them understand. They're not dealing with a helpless woman, with no one to stand beside her." Sarah had looked down at their joined hands, his calloused and strong from years of honest work, hers smaller, but growing steadier each day away from Charles's influence. "And if we lose, then we lose together, but at least we'll have fought for something worth keeping." The conviction in his voice had been absolute, unshakable, in a way that made Sarah believe, for the first time since receiving the telegram, that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to run anymore. Maybe she'd found someone willing to stand and fight beside her. What would that mean? Fighting together. Jacob's thumb had traced across her knuckles, a gentle touch that somehow conveyed more protection than all of Charles's possessive gestures ever had. "It means trusting me to help carry this burden. It means letting Emma and Thomas know they might have to be brave, but that they won't be abandoned. It means believing that sometimes the family you choose is stronger than the one that claims you by law." Outside, the wind had picked up again, rattling the windows and reminding them both of the storm that was coming, not just the weather, but the human tempest that Edmund Worthington would bring with him when he arrived to claim what he believed belonged to his family. The telegram said legal action was proceeding, Sarah had said, her practical mind already working through implications. "That means they're confident they have grounds to take the baby. Then we'll have to be more confident that they don't." Jacob had squeezed her hand gently. "Do you trust me, Sarah?" The question had hung between them like a bridge she could choose to cross or turn away from. In the firelight, Jacob's face had been serious, but not demanding, patient in the way he'd been with Emma and Thomas, willing to wait for her to find her own courage. "Yes," she'd whispered, the word carrying more weight than any vow she'd ever spoken. "I trust you." And in that moment, sitting in a cabin surrounded by Wyoming wilderness with winter pressing against the windows, Sarah McKenna had made the first truly free choice of her adult life. Not to run, but to stand. Not to face her fears alone, but to accept the hand extended in partnership. The Worthingtons were coming, but they would find her ready. The morning after the telegram arrived, Sarah woke to find Jacob already gone from the cabin, his absence marked by the cold space where his bedroll usually lay near the fireplace. She'd grown accustomed to the sound of his quiet movements in the pre-dawn hours, the careful way he built up the fire, the soft rustle of clothing, as he dressed for morning chores. Today, the silence felt ominous. She found him in the barn, standing before a wooden crate that hadn't been there the day before. As she approached, she could see he was cleaning something with methodical precision, the kind of attention to detail that spoke of long practice. When he looked up at her approach, she saw he held a cavalry saber, its blade catching the early light that filtered through the barn's gaps. "I thought you should see this," Jacob said quietly, his voice carrying none of the uncertainty she'd expected after their conversation the night before. "Part of understanding what we're up against." The saber was beautiful in the way that weapons could be, functional, elegant, deadly. The brass guard gleamed from recent polishing, and the leather grip showed the wear patterns of a man's hand that had held it through countless drills and battles. Along the blade, Sarah could make out etched words. Capt. Jacob Thorne, 3rd Cavalry. Regiment, 1876-1882. I kept it after my discharge, Jacob explained, setting the weapon carefully back in its wooden cradle. Figured it was part of my story, even if it wasn't a part I wanted to remember most days. He met her eyes steadily. But the Worthingtons need to understand that you're not alone out here, that you're under the protection of someone who knows how to fight, and more importantly, knows how to win. Sarah reached out tentatively to touch the saber's scabbard, feeling the smooth leather beneath her fingertips. You were an officer, captain, led men through some of the worst fighting the territory saw. Jacob's voice carried no boast, only fact. I know how to read people, how to plan campaigns, how to use resources most folks wouldn't think of as weapons. Money and lawyers aren't the only kinds of power, Sarah. The weight of his protection settled around her like a warm cloak, but with it came a sharp awareness of what she was asking him to risk. Jacob, if you stand with me against the Worthingtons, they'll try to destroy you too. They have connections that reach far beyond Boston, political influence, business partnerships. They could make life very difficult for you here. Jacob's smile was grim, but not without humor. Let them try. I've faced down Sioux war parties and Mexican bandits. I think I can handle some Eastern bankers who've never had dirt under their fingernails. The sound of children's voices drifted from the cabin, and they both turned toward the sound. Emma was helping Thomas with his morning washing, her patient voice guiding him through the routine their mother had established. The normalcy of it struck Sarah with sudden force. How quickly she'd become part of this daily rhythm, how natural it felt to worry about Thomas's tendency to splash water everywhere, or Emma's habit of braiding her hair too tightly. We need to tell them something, Sarah said, her hand instinctively moving to cover her growing belly. They'll sense that something's changed. We tell them the truth, carefully, but honestly. Jacob secured the saber and closed the crate. His movements decisive. They've already lost their mother. They deserve to know that someone might try to take you away too, but that we're going to fight to prevent it. Walking back to the cabin together, Sarah felt the first stirrings of something she hadn't experienced since Charles's death. The sense of being part of a partnership rather than bearing her burdens alone. Jacob moved beside her with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to facing challenges head-on, and for the first time since receiving the telegram, she allowed herself to believe they might actually succeed. Inside, Emma was attempting to braid Thomas's hair into what she called warrior braids, much to her little brother's delight. The sight made Sarah's heart clench with protective love. These children who had accepted her so completely, who called her Mama Sarah with such trust, who had no idea that forces beyond their understanding might tear their newly reconstructed family apart. Emma, Thomas, come sit with us, Jacob said, settling into his chair by the fire. Mama Sarah and I need to talk with you about something important. The children arranged themselves on the small rug before the fireplace. Emma automatically pulling Thomas closer when she sensed the seriousness in Jacob's tone. Their faces turned up expectantly, and Sarah was struck by how much they'd both changed in the weeks since her arrival. Emma's cheeks had filled out with regular meals, and Thomas no longer started at unexpected sounds. They looked like children who felt safe. You remember how we've talked about families, Jacob began, his voice gentle but clear. How sometimes people become family not because they're born related, but because they choose to love and care for each other? Both children nodded, Emma's hand finding Thomas's automatically. Well, Mama Sarah has become family to us in that special way, but there are some people from her old life who don't understand that, and they might try to cause trouble for all of us. Thomas's lower lip began to tremble. Are they going to take Mama Sarah away? Sarah leaned forward, reaching out to cup the little boy's face in her hands. They're going to try, sweetheart. But your papa and I are going to do everything we can to make sure that doesn't happen. What kind of trouble? Emma asked, her 8-year-old mind already working through possibilities with disturbing clarity. Jacob and Sarah exchanged a look before he answered. There might be men who come here asking questions. There might be legal papers and court hearings. It could get confusing and scary for a while. But we're going to stay together. Emma's voice was small but determined. That's what we're going to fight for, Sarah said firmly. All of us together. But I need you both to know that it might mean some difficult times ahead. You might have to be very brave. Thomas scrambled into Sarah's lap, his small arms wrapping around her neck with fierce intensity. I don't want you to go away, he whispered. Against her shoulder. I don't want to go either, Sarah whispered back, her voice thick with emotion. This is my home now. You're my children now, and I'm going to fight to keep it that way. Emma rose from her place on the rug and came to stand beside Jacob's chair, her hand resting on his arm, in a gesture that seemed far too mature for her years. What do you need us to do, Papa? The question revealed the steel beneath Emma's gentle exterior, the resilience that had helped her care for Thomas and watch over their father during his illness. Looking at her, Sarah saw a glimpse of the strong woman she would become, shaped by early loss but not broken by it. Be yourselves, Jacob said, covering Emma's small hand with his larger one. Keep being the wonderful children you are. Help Mama Sarah when she needs it, especially as the baby gets closer to being born. And if strangers come asking questions, tell them the truth, that this is your family and you're happy here. The mention of the baby brought a smile to Thomas's tear-stained face. The baby's going to be our brother or sister, right? Right, Sarah confirmed, her hand moving to where the child rested beneath her heart. This baby will be born into our family, with all of us to love and protect it. The conversation continued for another hour, Jacob and Sarah answering the children's questions with careful honesty, while trying not to frighten them more than necessary. By the time they finished, both Emma and Thomas seemed to understand that, while challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Later, as the children played quietly with their toys, Sarah found herself studying the domestic scene with new eyes. The wooden horse that Thomas treasured, now mended and smooth from her careful repairs, seemed to represent something larger, the idea that broken things could be made whole again with patience and love. Emma's quiet humming as she sewed a dress for her corn-husk doll spoke of a child who felt secure enough to plan for tomorrow. This was what she was fighting for. Not just her own freedom or even her unborn child's future, but this sense of belonging that she'd never experienced before. The Worthingtons could offer material advantages, fine clothes, expensive education, social connections, but they couldn't offer this feeling of being valued for who she was rather than what she represented. Sarah. Jacob's voice drew her from her reverie. He was standing by the window, his expression thoughtful. There's something else we need to discuss, the practical side of what's coming. She joined him at the window, looking out at the landscape that had become so familiar. What kind of practical considerations? Legal representation, documentation, character witnesses. Jacob's tone was businesslike but not cold. If the Worthingtons are serious about legal action, we need to be prepared to meet them in court, with more than just good intentions. Do you know lawyers who would take a case like this? I know people who know lawyers, former army contacts, territorial officials, men who understand that justice isn't always about who has the most money. Jacob turned to face her fully. But Sarah, there's something I want to propose, something that might strengthen our position considerably. The seriousness in his voice made her pulse quicken. What kind of proposal? Marriage. Real marriage. Not just the arrangement we have now. Jacob's words were quiet but steady. If you're my wife in the eyes of the law, if those children are legally mine through adoption, it becomes much harder for the Worthingtons to claim you're an unfit mother living in an irregular situation. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Marriage to Jacob had been a distant possibility. She'd barely allowed herself to consider something that might happen someday if they continued to care for each other as they had been. But as a strategic necessity, immediate and practical, it felt overwhelming. "Jacob, I can't ask you to tie yourself to my problems legally. If this goes badly, it won't go badly," he interrupted gently. But even if it did, I'd rather face the consequences as your husband than watch from the sidelines as someone else decides your fate." She studied his face, searching for any sign that this proposal was born from duty rather than genuine feeling. What she saw instead was the same steady warmth that had drawn her to trust him in the first place, combined with a determination that reminded her why he'd been successful as a military officer. "Is this what you want, Jacob? Really want, not just what seems strategically wise?" His hand came up to cup her cheek, thumb brushing across the skin beneath her eye with infinite gentleness. "Sarah, 3 weeks ago I was dying, not just from fever, but from giving up. You didn't just save my life, you gave me a reason to want to live it. If you'll have me, I want to be your husband in every sense of the word." The declaration hung between them like a bridge, solid and real and terrifying. In its implications, Sarah thought of Charles, whose proposals had been calculated affairs designed to secure social advantage. This felt entirely different, an offering made freely, without demands or conditions, based on what they'd already built together rather than promises of what might be. The children would be thrilled. "Emma asked me just yesterday if you were going to be her real mama forever." Jacob's smile was soft but certain. "They've already accepted you as family, Sarah. This would just make it official." Outside, snow had begun to fall again, large flakes that caught the window glass and melted into tiny rivers. Soon, the mountain passes would be completely impassable, cutting them off from the outside world until spring. It was an isolation that had once frightened Sarah, but now felt like a gift. Time to prepare, to strengthen their defenses, to become the family they needed to be, to face whatever the Worthingtons brought against them. "Yes," she said quietly, the word carrying the weight of commitment she'd never been able to give freely before. "Yes, I'll marry you, Jacob Thorne." His smile transformed his entire face, erasing years of grief and worry in an instant. When he leaned down to kiss her, it was with a reverence that made her heart race, and a promise that made her believe they really could build something strong enough to withstand any storm. The wedding took place 3 days later, on a crisp February morning, when the snow sparkled like scattered diamonds across the Wyoming landscape. Pastor Williams had made the journey from Cedar Ridge despite the weather, his weathered face creased with smile lines as he performed the simple ceremony in the cabin's main room. Emma had insisted on braiding wildflowers, dried ones she'd saved from autumn, into Sarah's hair, while Thomas had appointed himself the keeper of the rings, clutching them in his small fists with solemn importance. Sarah wore Mary's best dress, altered carefully to accommodate her pregnancy. The deep blue wool brought out the color of her eyes, and Jacob had looked at her as if she were something precious when she'd appeared from the bedroom where Emma had helped her prepare. There had been no grand gestures or elaborate preparations, but the ceremony had felt more meaningful than anything she'd experienced in Boston's finest churches. "Do you, Sarah, take Jacob to be your husband, to stand beside him in joy and sorrow, in plenty and in want, for all the days of your life?" "I do," she'd whispered, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was promising. When Jacob had slipped the simple gold band onto her finger, Mary's ring, offered with Emma's blessing, Sarah had felt the weight of genuine commitment. For the first time in her life, this wasn't a transaction or a social arrangement, but a choice made freely by two people who had found something worth protecting together. The kiss that sealed their vows had been tender, respectful, and full of promise. Emma had clapped with delight, while Thomas had cheered, and Pastor Williams had proclaimed them husband and wife with the satisfaction of a man who believed in the power of love to heal wounded hearts. Now, a week into their marriage, Sarah was discovering the complex dynamics of being Jacob's wife rather than simply the woman helping his family. They were learning to navigate the space between them with careful respect, sharing a home but not yet a bed, building intimacy through small gestures and shared responsibilities rather than grand romantic declarations. The wooden horse that Thomas treasured had become a symbol of this new phase in their relationship. The night before their wedding, Sarah had found Jacob in the barn, carving delicate details into a new toy, a small wooden cradle, perfectly scaled for Emma's cornhusk doll, but clearly intended as practice for something larger. His hands had moved with surprising grace for their size, shaping the tiny rockers with the same patience he showed in all his work. "For the baby?" Sarah had asked, settling beside him on the workbench. "Eventually. Thought I should remember how it's done." Jacob had paused in his carving to look at her. "Mary made Emma's cradle and Thomas's too. She was better at the fine work than I am." There had been no sadness in his voice, only acceptance, and perhaps a touch of pride in his late wife's skills. Sarah had realized then that Mary's memory wasn't a barrier between them, but rather a foundation, proof that Jacob knew how to love completely and faithfully, that he understood the daily work of building a life with someone. "Will you teach me?" she'd asked, nodding toward the half-finished cradle. Jacob's surprise had been evident, but pleased. "You want to learn woodworking?" "I want to learn everything I need to know to be part of this life. Really part of it." Sarah had placed her hand over his on the carving knife. "I've spent too many years being ornamental, Jacob. I want to be useful." That conversation had led to daily lessons after the children's bedtime, Jacob's patient instruction, helping Sarah master the basic techniques of working with wood. Her first attempts had been clumsy, the knife slipping in her inexperienced grip, but Jacob's steady hands had guided hers until she began to feel the rhythm of the work. "It's about understanding the grain," he'd explained one evening as she practiced shaping a simple spoon. "Wood wants to split in certain directions, curve in others. You work with it, not against it." The metaphor hadn't been lost on Sarah. Their entire relationship felt like learning to work with natural grain rather than forcing unwanted shapes. Jacob never demanded more affection than she was ready to give, never pressed for intimacy beyond what felt comfortable, never made her feel guilty for the walls she was still learning to lower. But those walls were coming down, slowly and steadily, like snow melting in spring sunshine. When Jacob caught her eye across the dinner table and smiled, Sarah felt warmth spread through her chest. When he helped her with the heavy water buckets, his hands brushing hers in the transfer, she found herself lingering in the contact. When she woke in the night and heard him moving quietly to check on the children, she felt the deep satisfaction of being partnered with a good man. The children, for their part, had adapted to the change with the resilience that seemed to define their young lives. Emma had taken to calling them Mama and Papa with natural ease, while Thomas had appointed himself the guardian of his baby, frequently placing protective hands on Sarah's growing belly and whispering secrets to the child within. "The baby's going to love the cradle Papa's making," Thomas had confided to Sarah one morning as she helped him dress. "And the wooden animals I'm going to carve when I'm big enough to use the knife." "What kind of animals?" Sarah had asked, charmed by his planning. "Horses like mine, and maybe a bear, but a friendly one. And definitely a rabbit, because rabbits are soft, and babies like soft things." These conversations, filled with innocent certainty about their future together, both warmed Sarah's heart and frightened her. The children had already suffered the loss of their mother. The thought of them losing another maternal figure to the Worthingtons' legal maneuvering was almost unbearable. It was during one of these moments of worry that Sarah experienced the first signs of trouble with her pregnancy. She'd been hanging laundry behind the cabin when a sharp pain had doubled her over, followed by cramping that sent her to her knees in the snow. The pain had lasted only minutes, but it had been intense enough to leave her shaking and uncertain. Jacob had found her there, pale and frightened, and had carried her inside without question or hesitation. His hands had been gentle as he'd helped her to bed, his voice calm as he'd questioned her about the pain and its intensity. "Could be nothing," he'd said, though his eyes had shown worry. "But Dr. Morrison in town mentioned that stress can cause problems with pregnancies. Maybe we should have him come take a look." The idea of bringing a doctor to examine her, of admitting vulnerability when they needed to appear strong, had made Sarah resist initially. But as the cramping had continued sporadically over the next day, she'd finally agreed that they needed medical attention. Dr. Morrison had arrived 2 days later, a kindly man in his 60s who'd delivered half the babies in Cedar Ridge over the past decade. His examination had been thorough but gentle, his questions careful and respectful. When he'd finished, his expression had been reassuring but serious. "The baby's fine," he'd told them both. "Strong heartbeat, good position, but Mrs. Thorne needs rest and reduced stress. Whatever's been weighing on her mind needs to be set aside, as much as possible." Jacob had squeezed Sarah's hand at the diagnosis, his relief evident. "What kind of rest? What should we be doing differently? Less physical work, more time off her feet. Good nutrition, which you're clearly providing. And most importantly, peace of mind." Dr. Morrison had packed his instruments with practiced efficiency. Worry is harder on an expecting mother than most people realize. After the doctor's departure, Jacob had insisted on taking over even more of the household duties, despite Sarah's protests that she wasn't an invalid. He'd rearranged their daily routines to ensure she had regular rest periods, and he'd begun handling all the trips to town himself, unwilling to subject her to the stress of potential encounters with strangers asking questions. But it was impossible to eliminate all sources of worry. Letters had begun arriving at the general store in Cedar Ridge, formal communications from lawyers in Boston, inquiries from private investigators, documents that Jacob reviewed with grim attention before sharing the necessary details with Sarah. "They're building a case," he'd explained one evening as he'd read through the latest correspondence, "claiming that you abandoned your responsibilities, that you're unfit to raise a child, that the baby would be better off with relatives who can provide proper advantages." "What kind of advantages?" Sarah had asked, though she'd suspected she knew the answer. "Education, social connections, financial security, everything they think money can buy." Jacob's voice had carried disgust. "They're painting a picture of you as a woman who ran away from her duty and is now living in primitive conditions with a man of questionable character." The characterization had stung, even though Sarah had expected it. The Worthingtons' version of her story bore little resemblance to her actual experience, but she knew it would sound compelling to a judge who had never faced the choice between physical safety and social expectation. "What about their investigation into you?" she'd asked. "Have they found anything they can use?" Jacob's smile had been grim but not worried. "They've found my military record, my discharge papers, my property holdings. If anything, their investigation is helping our case. Hard to argue that a Medal of Honor recipient is an unsuitable father figure." The mention of his medal had reminded Sarah of how much Jacob was risking by standing with her. His reputation, his property, his children's security, all of it was now tied to the outcome of her legal battle. The weight of that responsibility sometimes made it hard for her to breathe. "Jacob," she'd said quietly, "if this becomes too dangerous for Emma and Thomas, if there's any chance the Worthingtons might try to take them too, they won't." His voice had been absolute, final. "I have legal custody of my children, established when Mary died. No Boston lawyer is going to change that. But if they try, then they'll discover that taking children from a war hero is considerably more difficult than taking them from a widow with no connections." Jacob had set aside the letters and moved to sit beside her on the sofa. "Sarah, you need to understand something. I'm not helping you out of charity or misplaced chivalry. I'm protecting my family, all of my family." The conviction in his voice had been unshakable, and Sarah had felt some of her worry ease. But that night, As she'd lain in her bed listening to Jacob's quiet breathing from his bedroll near the fire, she'd found herself thinking about the precarious nature of the happiness they'd built. Outside, a late winter storm had been building, wind rattling the windows and promising another heavy snowfall. Sarah had placed her hand on her belly, feeling the baby's gentle movements, and had made a silent promise. Whatever came next, whatever the Worthingtons tried to do, she wouldn't let fear rob her of these precious moments with the family she'd never expected to find. In the morning, Jacob had found her in the kitchen before dawn, already preparing breakfast, despite his insistence that she rest more. When he'd protested, she'd silenced him with a kiss, their first truly spontaneous gesture of affection, born from gratitude and growing love rather than ceremony or strategy. "Good morning, husband," she'd whispered against his lips, and had felt his smile in return. "Good morning, wife," he'd replied, and in that simple exchange, Sarah had heard the promise of all the mornings yet to come, if they could find the strength to fight for them. Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it the sound of melting snow and the first tentative bird songs that promised winter's end. Sarah stood at the kitchen window, watching Jacob and Thomas work together to repair the chicken coop that had suffered damage during the last blizzard. Her pregnancy had progressed smoothly since the scare in February, and at 7 months, she felt the baby's movements grow stronger each day. The bundle of love letters had been discovered quite by accident 3 days earlier, when Sarah had been helping Emma organize the bedroom that had once belonged to Jacob and Mary. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard, wrapped in oiled cloth that had preserved them through the harsh Wyoming winters, were dozens of letters spanning the early years of Jacob and Mary's marriage. Sarah had hesitated before reading them, aware that she was intruding on something deeply personal. But Emma had pressed them into her hands with solemn eyes, saying, "Mama Mary would want you to read them. She'd want you to know how much love Papa has to give." The letters had revealed a side of Jacob that Sarah was only beginning to discover, a man capable of profound tenderness, of expressing emotions with eloquence that his everyday manner rarely displayed. Mary had clearly been his perfect match, sharing his love of the land, his dreams for their children's future, his quiet faith in the power of simple, honest living. "My dearest Mary," one letter had begun, "I find myself thinking of you constantly as I ride the territory boundaries, not just missing you, though I do miss you more than words can express, but marveling at how you've made our little homestead into something I never knew I needed. You've given me not just a home, but a reason to believe that peace is possible after war, that healing can follow heartbreak. When I return to you and our children, I'm reminded daily that the greatest victories aren't won on battlefields, but in the quiet moments when a man realizes he has everything he needs right before him." Reading those words, Sarah had felt both humbled and hopeful. They showed her that Jacob understood love as something built through daily choices, sustained through difficulty, deepened by shared experience. If he had loved Mary with such devotion, such constancy, perhaps he could learn to love her in the same way. But the letters had also made her acutely aware of how much she still had to learn about being a wife to this man, a mother to his children, a partner in building the kind of life they would need to weather whatever storms lay ahead. "You're quiet today," Jacob observed, as he and Thomas returned from their work on the chicken coop. His hands were dirty from the repair work, but his eyes were bright with the satisfaction of a job well done. Thomas bounded ahead of him, eager to show Sarah the new eggs they'd collected. "Just thinking," Sarah replied, accepting Thomas's offering, "of warm eggs with appropriate admiration. About us, about the life we're building here." Jacob studied her face with the careful attention she'd come to recognize as his way of reading situations. "Good thoughts or worrying thoughts?" "Both, I suppose." Sarah set the eggs carefully in a bowl, then turned to face him fully. "I found Mary's letters yesterday. Emma showed them to me." Understanding flickered across Jacob's features, followed by something that might have been concern. "And they were beautiful. She loved you very much, and you loved her the same way. Sarah paused, choosing her words carefully. I'm not trying to replace her, Jacob. I couldn't if I wanted to. But I want to understand what love looks like, in your world, what it means to be truly partnered with someone. Jacob was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving to where Emma was setting the table for their midday meal, then to Thomas, as he carefully washed his hands at the basin. When he looked back at Sarah, his expression was serious but not guarded. Mary and I grew up together. We learned how to love each other over years, through shared experiences and common dreams. He stepped closer, close enough that Sarah could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. What we have is different, Sarah. It started with necessity and grew into something deeper, but that doesn't make it less valuable. Sometimes the strongest foundations are built on mutual respect and shared purpose rather than childhood romance. The honesty in his voice reassured her, even as it challenged her to think differently about what their marriage could become. I want to be a true partner to you, Jacob, not just someone you're protecting, but someone who contributes equally to what we're building. You already are. His answer came without hesitation. You saved our lives when we were dying. You've brought joy back to my children. You've made this house feel like a home again. But if you're asking whether I want more from our marriage than convenience and companionship, then yes, I do. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither had been quite ready to cross before this moment. Sarah felt her heart racing, not with fear, but with anticipation. What kind of more? The kind where we trust each other completely, where we share not just responsibilities, but dreams. Where we don't just care for each other out of duty, but because we choose to love each other every day. Jacob's voice was quiet, but certain. Is that something you might want too? Before Sarah could answer, Emma's voice called them to dinner, breaking the intimate moment but not its significance. As they gathered around the table, Emma chattering about her plans for a spring garden, Thomas describing the baby chickens he was certain would hatch soon, Sarah found herself studying the family dynamics with new awareness. This was what love looked like in everyday practice. Jacob's patient correction when Thomas forgot his table manners, Emma's proud display of the letters she'd been practicing, the way they all automatically made room for Sarah's growing belly when she needed to. Shift position. Love wasn't grand gestures or passionate declarations, but the accumulation of small kindnesses, shared laughter, mutual support. After the meal, as Jacob returned to his outdoor work and the children settled into their afternoon lessons, Sarah found herself drawn back to Mary's letters. She selected one at random and read, "Dearest Jacob, Emma took her first steps today while you were in town. I wanted to wait for you to see this milestone, but she was determined to reach the wooden horse that Thomas left across the room, watching. Her little face light up with triumph when she succeeded, reminded me that our children will always be reaching for something just beyond their grasp. Our job is not to make the path easy, but to give them the strength and courage to keep walking when the way becomes difficult. I see so much of your determination in her, your unwillingness to give up when something matters. These are the gifts we give our children, not material possessions, but character traits that will serve them long after we're gone." The passage struck Sarah with particular force, not just for its wisdom about child rearing, but for its insight into the kind of legacy that truly mattered. The Worthingtons could offer her baby material advantages, expensive education, social connections, but they couldn't offer the deep security that came from being genuinely wanted, unconditionally loved, valued for who you were, rather than what you represented. That evening, as Sarah helped Emma prepare for bed, the little girl surprised her with a question that revealed how much the 8-year-old understood about their situation. "Mama Sarah, are the bad people from Boston going to try to take our baby away?" Sarah's hands stilled in Emma's hair, her heart clenching at the fear in the child's voice. "Why do you ask, sweetheart? I heard Papa talking to Mr. Henderson yesterday. He said there might be lawyers coming, people who think babies should live with rich families instead of families that love them. Emma turned in Sarah's lap to face her directly. But that's silly, isn't it? Love is more important than money. The simple certainty in Emma's voice brought tears to Sarah's eyes. Yes, darling, love is definitely more important than money. But sometimes grown-ups make things complicated when they should be simple. Will you and Papa fight for our baby? With everything we have, Sarah promised, her voice fierce with determination. This baby belongs with us, with you and Thomas and Papa and me. We're a family, and families protect each other. Emma nodded solemnly, then surprised Sarah by placing her small hand on the rounded curve of her belly. I think the baby knows we love it already. It kicks happy kicks when we talk to it. As if summoned by Emma's words, the baby delivered a particularly strong kick that made both of them giggle. In that moment, sitting in the lamplight with Emma's warm weight in her lap and new life moving beneath her heart, Sarah felt a fierce protectiveness rise within her that she'd never experienced before. Let the Worthingtons come with their lawyers and their money and their claims of superior advantages. They would find a family united, strong in their bonds, unshakable in their determination to protect what they'd built together. Sarah was no longer the frightened woman who had fled Boston in the dark of night. She was Emma and Thomas's mama Sarah, Jacob's wife, and the expectant mother of a child who would know from birth that it was wanted, cherished, and fiercely defended. Later that night, as she and Jacob sat by the fire working on their respective evening tasks, she mending a shirt, he carving details into the baby's cradle, Sarah broke the comfortable silence between them. Jacob, I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about wanting more from our marriage. His hands stilled on the wood, but he didn't look up immediately. And I want that too. Not just the safety and partnership we have now, but the real intimacy that comes from choosing each other completely. Sarah set aside her mending to look at him directly. I'm not ready for everything that might mean not yet, but I want to be. I want to learn how to love you the way Mary did in my own way. Jacob's smile was soft but radiant, transforming his weathered features with genuine joy. We have time, Sarah, all the time we need. Love isn't something that can be rushed or forced. It grows when it's tended carefully, like everything else worth having. Outside, spring peepers had begun their evening chorus, the sound of new life emerging after winter's sleep. Inside the cabin, by the warmth of their fire, Sarah felt something similar stirring within her heart, the promise of love taking root, growing stronger with each passing day, preparing to bloom when the time was right. The contractions had started. In the pre-dawn hours of a late April morning, when the world outside was caught between winter's last grasp and spring's determined arrival. Sarah had awakened to pain that wrapped around her middle like an iron band, squeezing with an intensity that left her breathless and disoriented. For a moment, she'd thought it was another false alarm, like the one in February, but the regular rhythm and increasing strength told her otherwise. The baby was coming early, not dangerously so, but early enough to catch them all unprepared for the reality of birth in their remote homestead. Dr. Morrison was 3 hours away in good weather, and the spring thaw had turned the mountain roads into treacherous rivers of mud that would be nearly impassable for a wagon. Jacob, Sarah had whispered, her voice tight with pain and effort. It's time. He'd awakened instantly, the soldier's ability to move from sleep to full alertness serving him well in this domestic crisis. One look at Sarah's face had told him everything he needed to know, and he'd moved with calm efficiency that helped steady her fears. How long have you been having pains? He'd asked while helping her sit up against the pillows. About an hour. They're getting stronger. Another contraction had seized her then, and Sarah had gripped Jacob's hand with surprising force. Baby's not supposed to come for another month. Babies don't always follow schedules, Jacob had said gently. Let me wake Emma. We're going to need her help. The silver locket had been Sarah's mother's, the only thing of real value she'd brought. With her from Boston, she'd worn it constantly since her flight west, a talisman that connected her to the woman who had taught her about strength in the face of adversity. Now, as the contractions grew stronger, and she realized her baby would be born in this frontier cabin with only her family to help, Sarah had made a decision that felt both terrifying and absolutely right. "Emma," she'd called to the little girl who was helping Jacob gather clean linens and boil water. "Come here, sweetheart." Emma had approached the bed with the serious expression she wore when she knew something important was happening. At 8 years old, she'd already seen more of life's harsh realities than most children, but she faced each new challenge with a maturity that never failed to amaze Sarah. "I want you to have this," Sarah had said, carefully lifting the silver locket over her head. The chain caught briefly in her hair, and Emma had helped untangle it with gentle fingers. "It was my mother's, and her mother's before that. It's meant to be passed from mother to daughter, and you're my daughter now." Emma's eyes had grown wide as she'd accepted the locket, understanding instinctively the significance of the gift. "But Mama, Sarah, what about your baby? What if it's a girl? Then someday, when you're grown and have daughters of your own, you'll decide who should have it next." Sarah had touched Emma's cheek softly. "That's how love works, sweetheart. It doesn't divide when it's shared. It multiplies." The next few hours had tested all of them in ways they'd never anticipated. Jacob had sent Thomas to stay with Mrs. Henderson, unwilling to expose the 5-year-old to the intensity of childbirth, but Emma had insisted on staying to help. Her small hands had proven invaluable, fetching cool water, holding Sarah's hand during the worst contractions, and providing the kind of calm presence that seemed to ease everyone's fears. Jacob, for his part, had shown the same steady competence. He brought to every crisis. He'd delivered foals and calves over the years, and while human birth was different, the basic principles were the same. His hands had been gentle but sure as he'd helped guide Sarah through the process, his voice a constant source of encouragement and strength. "You're doing beautifully," he'd murmured during one particularly difficult contraction. "The baby's coming just fine, almost here now." Sarah had found reserves of strength she'd never known she possessed, drawing not just on her own determination, but on the support of the family that surrounded her. When fear threatened to overwhelm her, she'd thought of Mary's words from the letters about giving children the strength to keep walking when the path became difficult. She was walking that difficult path now, bringing her child into the world. Through her own courage and the love of people who had chosen to stand beside her, the baby had arrived just as the sun was painting the eastern sky pink and gold, sliding into Jacob's waiting hands with a lusty cry that announced to the world that another thorn had joined the family. Sarah had collapsed back against the pillows, exhausted but exhilarated, her heart overflowing with relief and joy. "A son," Jacob had said softly, his voice thick with emotion, as he'd cleaned the baby and wrapped him in the soft blankets Emma had prepared. "A healthy, perfect son." When he'd placed the infant in Sarah's arms, she'd felt a completeness she'd never imagined possible. The baby was small, but clearly strong, his tiny fists waving as he'd protested the sudden cold of the world outside. The womb. His hair was dark like Jacob's, but his eyes, when they'd briefly opened, had held the same deep blue as Sarah's own. "Hello, little one," she'd whispered, touching one miniature hand with her finger. "Welcome to your family." Emma had leaned in close, studying her new brother with fascination and immediate adoration. "He's beautiful, Mama Sarah. What are we going to name him?" Sarah had looked up at Jacob, realizing they'd been so focused on preparing for the legal battles ahead that they'd never discussed names for the baby. "What do you think?" Jacob had been quiet for a moment, his gaze moving between Sarah and the child in her arms. "Daniel," he'd said finally. "It means God is my judge. Seems fitting. Given what we're facing." "Daniel Thorne," Sarah had repeated, testing the sound of it. "I like it. Daniel Jacob Thorne, if that's all right with you." The inclusion of his name in their sons had clearly moved Jacob deeply when he'd leaned down to kiss her forehead. Sarah had seen tears in his eyes, tears of joy, relief and love that needed no words to express. The recovery had been more challenging than the birth itself. Sarah had lost more blood than Jacob was comfortable with, and her exhaustion had been so complete that she'd slept for most of the next 2 days, waking only to nurse Daniel and accept the broths and teas that Jacob pressed on her with gentle insistence. Emma had appointed herself Daniel's guardian, sitting beside Sarah's bed during those first crucial days, alert for any sign that her new brother needed attention. She'd helped with the endless tasks that came with a newborn, washing tiny clothes, changing diapers, rocking him when he fussed. Her devotion had been complete and immediate, as if Daniel had always been part of their family. Thomas, when he'd returned from Mrs. Henderson's, had been initially uncertain about the small, noisy addition to their household. But when Daniel had wrapped his tiny fingers around Thomas's thumb, the 5-year-old had been won over completely. "He likes me," Thomas had announced with wonder. "He's holding on tight so I won't go away. That's because you're his big brother," Sarah had explained. "It's your job to help take care of him and teach him important things as he grows up." The responsibility had clearly pleased Thomas, who'd begun planning all the lessons he would share with Daniel: how to carve wood, how to take care of the animals, how to be brave when storms came. His earnest preparations had brought smiles to everyone's faces and had helped cement Daniel's place in their family structure. But it was Jacob's transformation that had moved Sarah most deeply. She'd watched him hold Daniel with the careful reverence of a man who understood the preciousness of new life, had seen him change diapers and prepare bottles with the same meticulous attention he brought to caring for his horses. When Daniel cried in the night, Jacob was always the first to wake, ready to walk the floor with his son until the baby settled back to sleep. "You're a natural father," Sarah had observed one evening as she'd watched Jacob give Daniel his evening feeding. "I've had practice," Jacob had replied, but there had been something different in his voice, a contentment that hadn't been there even with Emma and Thomas. "But this feels different somehow. Maybe because I'm not grieving while I'm learning to love him." The comment had revealed more than Jacob might have intended about his emotional state during Mary's final illness and after her death. Sarah had realized that Daniel's birth represented not just the addition of a new family member, but Jacob's full return to life after the dark period that had nearly cost him everything. "Do you think he looks like me?" Sarah had asked, studying Daniel's sleeping face in the lamplight. "He looks like himself," Jacob had answered diplomatically, "but he has your chin, I think, and definitely your stubborn streak, judging by how he refuses to sleep when he's decided it's time to eat." They'd developed new rhythms to accommodate Daniel's needs: night feedings shared between them, afternoon naps when the baby slept, quiet conversations in the rocking chair Jacob had crafted during Sarah's final month of pregnancy. The chair had become Sarah's favorite spot in the cabin, positioned near the window where she could watch the spring transformation of their land while nursing their son. It was from that chair that Sarah had first noticed the riders approaching their homestead. On a warm May morning, when Daniel was 2 weeks old, 3 men on horseback, dressed in the dark suits that marked them as outsiders, riding with the purposeful pace of people who had business to conduct. Her heart had started racing before her mind had fully processed what their presence meant. "Jacob," she'd called, her voice carrying just enough urgency to bring him quickly from the barn where he'd been working. He'd taken one look at the approaching riders and had moved immediately to the gun rack by the door, checking his rifle with practiced efficiency. Not threatening, but ready, the stance of a man who'd learned that preparation prevented problems. "Emma, take Thomas and Daniel into the back room," he'd said quietly. "Stay there until I tell you it's safe to come out." The riders had stopped, at the edge of their property, close enough to make their business known, but far enough away to avoid seeming immediately threatening. The man in the center, older than his companions and clearly their leader, had touched his hat in a gesture of minimal politeness. "Mr. Thorne, my name is Edmund Worthington. I believe you know why I'm here." Sarah had felt her blood turn to ice. Edmund Worthington in person, no longer just a name on telegrams and legal documents, but a physical presence that represented everything she'd been running from. Even at a distance, she could see the family resemblance to Charles. The same cold assessment in his gaze, the same sense of entitlement in his posture. "I know exactly why you're here," Jacob had replied, his voice carrying across the space between them with military authority. "And I know you're not welcome on my land. We're not here to cause trouble, Mr. Thorne. We simply want to discuss a reasonable arrangement regarding the child that rightfully belongs to our family." "The only child here is my son," Jacob had said flatly. "Daniel Thorne, born on my property to my wife. If you have legal documents that say otherwise, you can present them to a judge in territorial court." Edmund's smile had been thin and unpleasant. "We have documents, Mr. Thorne, and we have resources you can't imagine. This doesn't have to be difficult, but it will be if you choose to make it so." From her position at the window, Sarah had watched the confrontation with her heart pounding and Daniel sleeping peacefully in her arms. The contrast had been stark, the innocent vulnerability of new life against the calculating coldness of men who saw that life as a commodity to be claimed. "Get off my land," Jacob had said, his voice carrying a finality that brooked no argument. "Now!" The riders had withdrawn, but slowly, making it clear that this was tactical rather than surrender. As they disappeared over the ridge that marked the edge of Jacob's property, Sarah had felt the weight of impending battle settle over their small homestead like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. "They'll be back," Jacob had said as he'd returned to the cabin, his expression grim but determined. "With lawyers and court orders and everything they think they need to take Daniel away from us." Sarah had looked down at her sleeping son, so small and perfect and completely unaware of the forces that wanted to tear him from the only family he'd ever known. "What do we do?" "We fight," Jacob had said simply. "We fight for our family, and we don't stop fighting until we win." The silver locket around Emma's neck had caught the afternoon light as the little girl had emerged from the back room, her face anxious but brave. "Are the bad men gone, Papa?" "For now," Jacob had answered. "But they'll be back, and when they come, we'll be ready for them." In the distance, thunder had begun to rumble, promising the kind of spring storm that could change the landscape overnight. Inside their cabin, surrounded by the people who had chosen to love each other against all odds, Sarah had felt her own resolve crystallizing like steel cooled in mountain snow. Let Edmund Worthington come with his lawyers and his money and his claims of rightful ownership. He would find a family that had been forged in the crucible of shared hardship, strengthened by mutual protection and united by bonds that no court could dissolve. The real battle was about to begin. The legal documents arrived on a Tuesday morning, in late May, delivered by a territorial marshal who looked uncomfortable with his task but determined to carry it out professionally. Sarah had been nursing Daniel in the rocking chair when she'd seen the official rider approaching, and her stomach had dropped with the certainty that their temporary peace was over. Jacob had accepted the papers with the same calm he'd shown when facing Edmund Worthington's visit 2 weeks earlier, but Sarah had seen the tension in his shoulders as he'd broken the wax seal and unfolded the documents. His expression had grown darker with each page he'd read, and by the time he'd finished, his jaw was set in the hard line she'd learned to recognize as barely controlled anger. "What do they say?" Sarah had asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Custody. Petition. Filed in Boston, but they're requesting transfer to territorial court here." Jacob's voice had been carefully controlled. "They're claiming that Daniel is the legitimate heir to Charles Worthington's estate and that his proper guardians should be his paternal relatives rather than—" He'd paused, his distaste evident. "Rather than an unfit mother living in irregular circumstances with a man of questionable character." The familiar characterizations had stung, but what had truly frightened Sarah was the legal weight behind them. What kind of evidence are they presenting? Jacob had turned to the second page, his frown deepening. This is where it gets complicated. They have a copy of Charles's will that I've never seen before. According to this document, any child born to Charles Worthington, regardless of the circumstances of birth, becomes a ward of the Worthington estate until age 21. Sarah's blood had turned cold. That's impossible. Charles never mentioned anything like that in his will. According to this, it was a codicil added 6 months before his death. A secret addition that wasn't revealed until after your disappearance prompted a more thorough investigation of his papers. Jacob had looked up from the documents, his eyes grim. Sarah, they're claiming that Charles knew about your pregnancy before he died. The words had hit her like a physical blow. That's not possible. I didn't even know myself until after the funeral. Are you certain about that? Sarah had thought back to those final weeks with Charles, remembering his increasingly erratic behavior, his accusations about her secretiveness, his demands to know where she went when she visited her sister. At the time, she'd attributed his suspicions to his naturally controlling nature, but now he was watching me more closely toward the end, she'd admitted reluctantly, following me sometimes when I left the house. I thought it was just his usual possessiveness, but if he'd hired someone to investigate, a private detective could have discovered signs of pregnancy before you were aware of them yourself, Jacob had said quietly. Medical consultations, changes in behavior, purchases that might indicate your condition. The implications had been staggering. If Charles had known about her pregnancy and had legally established his family's claim to the child, then Daniel's birth on Jacob's property to his legal wife might not be enough to protect him from the Worthingtons' reach. There's more, Jacob had continued, his voice growing heavier. They've also filed papers questioning the legitimacy of our marriage, claiming it was entered into fraudulently for the purpose of evading Charles's legal arrangements for his heir. Can they do that? Challenge a legal marriage? If they can. Prove fraud or deception, yes. They're arguing that you married me under false pretenses, concealing your pregnancy and your legal obligations to the Worthington estate. Jacob had set the papers aside and moved to stand beside her chair. But Sarah, there's something else you need to know, something about my own past that these documents have revealed. The serious tone in his voice had made her look up sharply. What kind of something? My discharge from the cavalry wasn't entirely voluntary. I was court-martialed for disobeying orders during a campaign against Sioux raiders in 1882. Jacob's hands had clenched briefly before he'd forced them to relax. The charges were eventually dropped and my record cleared, but the Worthingtons have uncovered the original accusations. Sarah had felt her world tilting sideways. What were the accusations? Refusing to participate in an attack on a civilian village. Children and elderly people who had nothing to do with the raids we were pursuing. Jacob's voice had been steady, but she'd heard the old pain beneath it. I was ordered to burn them out, and I refused. Said if that's what the army called justice, they could find another man to carry it out. The revelation had explained so much about Jacob, his careful morality, his protective instincts toward the vulnerable, his certainty about right and wrong that sometimes seemed absolute. But it had also revealed how the Worthingtons planned to attack his character. They're going to use that against you, Sarah had said, understanding immediately. They're going to try. Paint me as a man who can't follow orders, who puts his own judgment above legal authority. Combined with the challenges to our marriage, they're building a case that Daniel would be better off with responsible relatives who can provide proper guidance. The papers had contained one more devastating surprise. Edmund Worthington had filed an affidavit claiming that Sarah had been under medical care for nervous conditions during her marriage to Charles, including treatments for what he termed hysteria and violent temperament. The document had painted her as emotionally unstable, potentially dangerous to a child's well-being. "That's completely false," Sarah had said, her voice shaking with anger. "I was never treated for anything like that. But you were treated for injuries, weren't you? Doctor visits after Charles hurt you?" Sarah had nodded reluctantly, beginning to see how her medical history could be twisted to support the Worthingtons' claims. Dr. Harrison treated a broken wrist once and some bruised ribs another time, but he knew Charles was responsible. He never said anything about mental instability. Dr. Harrison might not be available to testify. According to these papers, he died of a heart attack 2 months ago. The news had felt like another blow in an increasingly devastating series. Dr. Harrison had been one of the few people in Boston who'd shown her genuine kindness, who'd treated her injuries without judgment, and had even suggested quietly that she might be happier somewhere far from Charles's influence. "So my medical records can be interpreted any way they choose, and the one person who knew the truth is dead," Sarah had said, her voice flat with despair. "That's what they're counting on. But Sarah, there's something else in these documents. That doesn't make sense." Jacob had picked up the papers again, flipping to a page near the end. "They've included a copy of what they claim is your marriage certificate to Charles. The date is wrong." Sarah had looked at the document he'd indicated, her confusion evident. "Wrong how? According to this, you were married to Charles 6 months earlier than you told me. But if that's true, then Daniel would have been conceived during your marriage, which strengthens their claim that he's a legitimate Worthington heir. That's not right. I know when I was married, June 15th, 1885. Sarah had studied the forged certificate with growing alarm. "This says January 15th. They've altered the date. Can you prove the correct date?" Sarah had thought frantically, trying to remember what documentation she might have that could establish the timeline. "My sister attended the wedding. Her guests, but proving it would require witnesses willing to testify against the Worthington family in Boston. People who probably depend on Worthington business interests for their livelihoods," Jacob had observed grimly. The full scope of what they were facing had become clear as they'd worked through the legal documents together. The Worthingtons hadn't just filed a simple custody petition. They'd crafted a comprehensive attack on every aspect of Sarah and Jacob's life together. Her mental stability, his military record, the legitimacy of their marriage, even the timing of Daniel's conception. Everything had been called into question with evidence that was either distorted or outright fabricated. "They're not just trying to take Daniel," Sarah had realized aloud. "They're trying to destroy our entire family. If they can prove our marriage is fraudulent, Emma and Thomas could be declared children in need of proper guardianship. If they can establish that I'm unfit due to my military record, they could claim authority over all of us." Jacob's voice had been grim, but not defeated. "This isn't just about one baby anymore, Sarah. This is about the survival of everything we've built." The magnitude of the threat had been overwhelming, but as Sarah had held Daniel close and watched Emma and Thomas playing quietly in the corner, she'd felt her resolve crystallizing rather than crumbling. The Worthingtons might have money and lawyers and fabricated evidence, but they'd made one crucial miscalculation. "They don't understand what they're really fighting," she'd said quietly. "What do you mean?" "They think this is about legal ownership, about bloodlines and inheritance rights, but that's not what Daniel represents to us." Sarah had looked down at her son's peaceful face, then up at Jacob's steady gaze. "He's not a Worthington heir who happened to be born here. He's a Thorne who was born into a family that chose to love him before he even drew breath." Jacob's expression had softened with understanding. The difference between claiming someone and choosing them. Exactly. And that difference is going to matter to a territorial judge who understands that family is about more than blood and money. The sound of horses approaching had interrupted their conversation, and Jacob had moved immediately to the window. More visitors. 3 riders, but not the same ones as before. This time, the visitors had been territorial officials, a court clerk and 2 deputies who'd come to serve additional papers and to schedule a formal hearing. The clerk, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, had been polite but official as he'd explained the legal proceedings. The matter of Worthington versus Thorne will be heard in Cheyenne in 6 weeks' time, he'd announced. Both parties are required to appear with legal representation and any witnesses they wish to present. 6 weeks, Jacob had repeated after the officials had departed. That's not much time to build a defense against this kind of coordinated attack. But as they'd sat together that evening, planning their response to the Worthingtons' legal assault, Sarah had felt something she hadn't expected: confidence, not in their ability to outspend or outmaneuver their opponents, but in the strength of what they'd built together. "Jacob," she'd said as they'd prepared for bed, "there's something I want you to know. When I fled Boston, I thought I was running toward freedom. But I was really running toward this, toward you, toward our children, toward the life we've made together, even knowing what it's going to cost us to keep it, especially knowing that." Sarah had reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers. "Because now I understand the difference between a life that's given to you and a life that you choose to build. Whatever happens in that courtroom, we built this together, and that's something no legal document can take away." Outside, spring rain had begun to fall, nourishing the garden Emma had planted and promising another season of growth and renewal. Inside their cabin, surrounded by the evidence of the life they'd created, Daniel's cradle, Emma's carefully tended schoolbooks, Thomas's collection of carved animals, the rocking chair where Sarah fed their son each evening, they'd made their final preparations for the battle that would determine whether love could triumph over law, whether chosen family could prove stronger than claimed inheritance. The Worthingtons had revealed their strategy, shown the full extent of their power and determination. Now it was time for the Thornes to show theirs. The Medal of Honor had been hidden for so long that Jacob had almost forgotten the weight it carried beyond its physical presence. Now, as he held the bronze star in his hands while Sarah nursed Daniel in the early morning light, he felt the full significance of what this small piece of metal could mean for their family's survival. "Tell me about the day you earned this," Sarah said quietly, her voice barely audible above Daniel's contented sounds. Jacob was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing the raised lettering that proclaimed his heroism in a conflict most people preferred to forget. It was during the Wounded Knee tensions, but before the massacre. A group of Lakota families had been caught between military positions, mostly women, children, elderly people who'd been separated from the main body during a forced relocation. He paused, the memories still painful even after all these years. "My commanding officer ordered us to treat them as hostiles, to use whatever force necessary to move them to the reservation. But when I saw what we were dealing with, hungry people protecting their children, not warriors preparing for battle, I couldn't follow those orders." "What did you do?" "I negotiated instead. Spent 3 days talking with their leader, sharing our rations, proving we could be trusted. Eventually convinced them to move voluntarily to safety." Jacob's voice grew quieter. "Saved 37 lives that day, including 12 children. The army called it exceptional valor in the face of overwhelming odds." Sarah reached out to cover his hand with hers. "And later you were court-martialed for refusing similar orders. Different situation, different commanding officer. By then, the policy had shifted toward more aggressive action against any native resistance. When I was ordered to burn out a village that contained mostly non-combatants, I refused again." Jacob met her eyes steadily. Same principle, different result. The morning light streaming through their cabin windows illuminated the medal's surface, catching the wear patterns where Jacob's thumb had rubbed the bronze smooth over years of handling. Sarah could see why he'd kept it hidden, not from shame, but from the complex emotions it represented. This small artifact embodied both his greatest triumph and his deepest conviction that some orders were too morally reprehensible to follow. "The Worthingtons don't understand what they're dealing with," Sarah said, her voice filled with quiet certainty. "They see your court-martial as evidence of insubordination, but any territorial judge will recognize it as proof of character." Jacob nodded slowly. "That's what I'm counting on. Out here, people understand that there's a difference between following orders and doing what's right. The medal proves I know how to serve with honor, and the court-martial proves I won't compromise my principles for convenience." Over the past 2 weeks, since receiving the legal documents, they'd worked tirelessly to prepare their defense. Jacob had sent letters to former Army colleagues, calling in favors from men who'd served under his command and witnessed his character firsthand. Sarah had begun documenting every detail of her life in Boston, creating a timeline that would expose the inconsistencies in the Worthingtons' fabricated evidence. The support from their community had been overwhelming. Pastor Williams had immediately offered to testify about their marriage ceremony and the family's standing in local society. Dr. Morrison had provided detailed medical records of Daniel's birth and Sarah's recovery, establishing the timeline that proved the baby had been conceived after Charles's death rather than during their marriage. Mrs. Henderson had surprised them all by revealing that she'd been keeping detailed notes about their family since Sarah's arrival, observations about the children's health and happiness, records of Sarah's pregnancy progress, accounts of Jacob's transformation from a grieving widower to a devoted father and husband. Her meticulous documentation would provide powerful testimony about the genuine nature of their family bonds. "You've been watching us that closely?" Sarah had asked when the elderly woman had shared her observations. "Honey, I've lived on this frontier for 40 years. I know the difference between people running a con and people building a real life together." Mrs. Henderson's weathered face had creased with determination. "Any fool can see that you love those children like they came from your own body, and that Jacob looks at you like you hung the moon. No Boston lawyer is going to convince me otherwise." Even more surprising had been the response from Jacob's former commanding officers. General George Crook himself had written a letter of recommendation, praising Jacob's service and explicitly addressing the circumstances of his court-martial. The letter had been carefully worded to present Jacob's refusal to follow immoral orders as evidence of the kind of principled leadership the Army needed more of, not less. Captain Thorne's actions during the disputed incident reflected the highest traditions of military service, the general had written. His willingness to place human decency above blind obedience to questionable orders demonstrated exactly the kind of moral courage that distinguishes true leaders from mere followers of protocol. But it was the support from unexpected quarters that had most moved Sarah. Emma's teacher, Mrs. Patterson, had requested permission to testify about the dramatic improvement in the little girl's academic performance and emotional stability since Sarah's arrival. Thomas's transformation from a frightened, withdrawn child to a confident, happy boy had been witnessed by everyone in their community. "These children were dying on the inside when I first met them," Dr. Morrison had told Sarah during one of his visits to check on Daniel. "Now they're thriving in ways that would be impossible if their home situation wasn't genuinely loving and stable." As the hearing date approached, Sarah found herself studying each member of their family with new appreciation for what they'd built together. Emma, now 9 years old, had become a capable young woman who helped manage household responsibilities with quiet competence. Her devotion to Daniel was absolute. She could calm him when he fussed, seemed to instinctively know what he needed, and spoke to him constantly in the gentle voice that had once soothed Thomas through his grief. Thomas had grown into his role as big brother with endearing seriousness. He'd appointed himself Daniel's protector and entertainer, spending hours making faces to elicit baby smiles and carefully showing his infant brother the treasures he'd collected. Smooth stones, interesting feathers, the wooden animals Jacob had helped him carve. His innocence about the legal threat to their family was both heartbreaking and inspiring. "When Daniel gets bigger, I'm going to teach him to ride horses," Thomas had announced one evening as they'd gathered around the dinner table, and how to find the best fishing spots, and how to carve toys that don't have splinters. "That sounds like an excellent plan," Jacob had replied seriously. "Daniel is lucky to have such a thoughtful big brother." The easy affection between Jacob and the children, the natural way they turned to him for guidance and comfort, would be impossible to fake or manufacture for a court's benefit. Any observer could see that these relationships had been built over time through shared experience, mutual trust, and genuine love. But it was her relationship with Jacob that had deepened most dramatically during their preparation for the legal battle. Working together to build their defense had required complete honesty about their pasts, total trust in each other's judgment, and absolute commitment to their shared future. The partnership that had begun as necessity had evolved into something much deeper. "Sarah," Jacob had said one evening as they'd worked on organizing witness statements, "I need you to know something before we go into that courtroom." She'd looked up from the papers she'd been reviewing, noting the serious tone in his voice. "I know this marriage started as a practical arrangement to protect you and the baby, and I know you agreed to it partly because you felt you had no other choice." Jacob had set aside his work to face her directly, but somewhere along the way it became real for me. Not just partnership or protection, but genuine love. "I need you to know that. Whatever happens in Cheyenne." Sarah had felt her heart race, with emotions she'd been carefully guarding. "Jacob, you don't have to say anything back. I just wanted you to know that fighting for this family isn't just duty for me anymore. It's fighting for the woman I love and the life we've chosen together." The declaration had hung between them like a bridge she could choose to cross or leave unexplored. In the lamplight, with Daniel sleeping peacefully in her arms and the sounds of Emma and Thomas settling into bed, Sarah had felt the last of her protective walls crumble. "It became real for me too," she'd whispered. "I love you, Jacob Thorne. Not just for what you've given me, but for who you are. For the man who earned that medal by saving lives instead of taking them. For the father who puts his children's needs above his own comfort. For the husband who chose to stand beside me when running would have been easier." The kiss they'd shared then had been different from any that had come before. Not ceremonial or strategic, but born from acknowledged love and shared commitment to the future they were building together. Now, 3 days before their departure for Cheyenne, Sarah felt a confidence that had nothing to do with legal strategies or witness testimony. They were fighting for something real, something that had been built through daily choices and sustained through genuine affection. The Worthingtons could bring their money and their lawyers and their fabricated evidence, but they couldn't manufacture the kind of love that filled this cabin. "Are you ready for this?" Jacob asked as he carefully placed the Medal of Honor back in its wooden box. Sarah looked around their home, at the rocking chair where she fed Daniel each evening, at Emma's schoolwork spread across the kitchen table, at Thomas's collection of wooden animals lined up on the windowsill, at the cradle Jacob had crafted with such care. This was what they were fighting to protect. Not just legal custody of a child, but the right to continue being the family they'd chosen to become. "I'm ready," she said, and meant it completely. Outside, the first hints of summer were beginning to show in the longer days and warmer nights. Inside their cabin, surrounded by the evidence of the life they'd built together, the Thorne family prepared to face the battle that would determine whether love could triumph over law, whether chosen bonds could prove stronger than claimed inheritance. In 3 days, they would travel to Cheyenne to fight for their future. But tonight, they were simply a family, complete, united, and unshakable in their commitment to each other. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together. The territorial courthouse in Cheyenne was an imposing structure of red brick and limestone that seemed designed to intimidate those who entered seeking justice. Sarah had never seen a building Quite like it. Grander than most structures in Wyoming Territory, but lacking the cold formality of Boston's legal institutions. As Jacob helped her down from their wagon, with 3-month-old Daniel sleeping peacefully in her arms, she felt the weight of everything they'd worked for hanging in the balance. The homestead deed, carefully folded in Jacob's coat pocket, represented more than just legal ownership of their land. It was proof of the solid foundation they'd built their family upon, evidence of Jacob's standing in the community, and symbol of the life they'd chosen to create together. The document bore his name, alone, establishing his legal rights and responsibilities in a way that would be crucial in the hearing to come. "Remember what we discussed," Jacob said quietly as they approached the courthouse steps. "Let our lawyer do most of the talking, but don't be afraid to speak from the heart when Judge Morrison asks you direct questions." Their attorney, Samuel Harrison, was a former cavalry officer who'd served under Jacob's command during the Indian campaigns. Now, a successful lawyer in Cheyenne, he'd agreed to represent them despite the powerful opposition they faced. His strategy was simple: establish the legitimacy of their family through documented evidence, expose the inconsistencies in the Worthingtons' claims, and let the genuine love between them speak for itself. The Worthingtons arrived yesterday, with 3 lawyers from Boston and a railroad car full of depositions, Harrison had warned them during their final preparation meeting. They're treating this like a military campaign, bringing overwhelming force to bear on what should be a straightforward custody matter. Inside the courthouse, Sarah got her first glimpse of Edmund Worthington since his threatening visit to their homestead. He sat at the plaintiff's table, surrounded by men in expensive suits, his cold eyes assessing the opposition with calculating precision. When his gaze fell on Daniel in Sarah's arms, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Not grandfatherly affection or concern for a child's welfare, but the satisfaction of a man viewing valuable property that would soon be in his possession. "Mrs. Thorne," Worthington's voice carried across the courtroom as they took their seats, "I trust you've considered our last offer of reasonable accommodation. It's not too late to avoid the unpleasantness of a public hearing." Jacob's hand found Sarah's immediately, his presence steadying her as she met Worthington's gaze directly. "Mr. Worthington, I've considered everything you've proposed. My answer remains the same. Daniel belongs with his family, his legal family," Worthington corrected smoothly, "which, according to the documentation we'll present today, does not include you or your current husband." Judge Thomas Morrison, no relation to their supportive Dr. Morrison, was a weathered man in his 60s who'd spent decades resolving disputes in the Wyoming Territory. His reputation was for fairness and practical wisdom, qualities that had made him respected throughout the region. As he called the hearing to order, Sarah felt cautiously optimistic that they would receive genuine consideration rather than the kind of predetermined judgment that money could buy in other jurisdictions. "This court will hear the matter of Worthington versus Thorne concerning custody of the minor child Daniel," Judge Morrison announced. "Mr. Blackwood, you may present the petitioner's case." Worthington's lead attorney was a thin, sharp-featured man whose Boston accent seemed particularly pronounced in the Wyoming courtroom. His opening statement painted Sarah as an unstable woman who had fled her responsibilities, deceived an honest frontiersman into marriage, and was now trying to deny a child his rightful inheritance and proper upbringing. "Your Honor, the evidence will show that the defendant, Sarah McKenna Worthington, deliberately concealed her pregnancy from her lawful husband's family, fled the jurisdiction to avoid her legal obligations, and entered into a fraudulent marriage for the sole purpose of evading the legitimate claims of the Worthington estate." Blackwood presented their fabricated evidence with polished precision. The altered marriage certificate that claimed to establish Daniel's conception during Sarah's marriage to Charles, the medical records twisted to suggest mental instability, the military documents that portrayed Jacob as an insubordinate soldier, unfit to raise children. The Worthington family seeks only what is rightfully theirs, Blackwood concluded. The return of Charles Worthington's son to his proper family, where he can receive the advantages of education, culture, and social position that his bloodline entitles him to receive. Sarah had listened to the distorted version of her life, with growing anger rather than fear. Every fabrication, every twisted interpretation of the truth only strengthened her resolve to fight for the real story to be heard. When Harrison rose to present their defense, she felt the confidence that came from knowing they had truth on their side. Your Honor, this case is not about inheritance or social position, Harrison began, his military bearing evident as he addressed the court. It is about a family that has been legally and lovingly formed according to the laws of Wyoming Territory, and about a child who has known no other parents than Jacob and Sarah Thorne. Harrison's presentation of their evidence was methodical and compelling. Dr. Morrison's medical records established the timeline that proved Daniel had been conceived after Charles's death. Pastor Williams's testimony about their marriage ceremony demonstrated its legitimacy and the genuine affection between the couple. Community witnesses spoke to the family's standing and the children's obvious happiness and health. But it was when Harrison presented Jacob's military record that the momentum in the courtroom began to shift decisively. General Crook's letter of recommendation was read aloud, painting Jacob's refusal to follow immoral orders as evidence of exactly the kind of principled leadership that made him an ideal father figure. Captain Thorne's actions during the disputed incident reflected the highest traditions of military service, Harrison read. His willingness to place human decency above blind obedience to questionable orders demonstrated exactly the kind of moral courage that distinguishes true leaders from mere followers of protocol. The Medal of Honor itself was presented as evidence, its bronze surface catching the afternoon light that streamed through the courthouse windows. Judge Morrison examined it carefully, clearly familiar with the significance of the decoration and the character it represented in its recipient. "Mr. Thorne," the judge said, "would you tell the court about the circumstances that led to this commendation?" Jacob rose with the quiet dignity that had made him an effective officer and would, Sarah hoped, make him a credible witness. His account of saving 37 lives through negotiation rather than violence was delivered simply, without embellishment or false modesty. "I saw families who were hungry and frightened, Your Honor. People protecting their children, not warriors preparing for battle. My oath as an officer was to serve with honor, and I couldn't see honor in harming defenseless people." And the later court-martial proceedings? Same principle, Your Honor. I was ordered to take actions against non-combatants that I believed were morally wrong. I chose to accept the consequences of disobedience rather than compromise my conscience. Blackwood's cross-examination attempted to portray Jacob's refusal to follow orders as evidence of instability and poor judgment, but the strategy backfired spectacularly. The more he pressed the issue, the more clearly Jacob's principled stand emerged as exactly the kind of character that any parent would want guiding their children. "So you admit, Mr. Thorne, that you place your personal judgment above legitimate authority?" "I place moral law above immoral orders, yes, sir. I believe that's what any decent man would do." The simple honesty of Jacob's response seemed to resonate throughout the courtroom. Sarah could see several spectators nodding in approval, and even Judge Morrison appeared impressed by Jacob's straightforward defense of his actions. When it came time for Sarah to testify, she felt the same calm certainty that had sustained her through the months of preparation. Harrison's questions allowed her to tell her story simply and honestly. Her marriage to Charles, his abusive behavior, her escape after his death, her discovery of pregnancy, her flight west, and her chance encounter with Jacob and his children. "Mrs. Thorne, why did you not contact the Worthington family when you discovered your pregnancy?" "Because I knew they would try to control my child the same way Charles had tried to control me," Sarah replied. "I wanted my baby to grow up knowing love rather than manipulation, freedom rather than possession. And what has Daniel's life been like since his birth? Sarah's voice grew warm as she described their family life, Jacob's gentle care during night feedings, Emma's devotion to her baby brother, Thomas's protective love, the way they'd all embraced Daniel as a cherished member of their family rather than a valuable commodity. Daniel has been loved from the moment he drew breath, Your Honor, not for what he might inherit or represent, but for who he is. He's surrounded by people who chose to love him, who see him as a blessing rather than a burden or an asset. Blackwood's cross-examination was aggressive, attempting to portray Sarah as an unstable woman who had abandoned her responsibilities and was now trying to justify her actions. But his polished Boston manner seemed increasingly out of place in the practical atmosphere of the territorial court, and his attacks on Sarah's character only served to highlight the contrast between the Worthingtons' calculating approach and the Thornes' obvious, genuine affection. Mrs. Thorne, isn't it true that you married Jacob Thorne solely to avoid your legal obligations to the Worthington estate? I married Jacob Thorne because he offered protection to me and my unborn child, when we had nowhere else to turn, Sarah replied steadily. But I stayed married to him because I came to love him and his children, and because together we built the kind of family I never knew was possible. As the afternoon wore on, the contrast between the two sides became increasingly clear. The Worthingtons presented their case with legal precision, but emotional coldness, focusing on property rights and inheritance law, while showing little genuine concern for Daniel's actual welfare. The Thornes' defense was built on documented truth and obvious love, presenting a family that had been formed through choice and sustained through mutual devotion. The climax of the hearing came when Judge Morrison asked to see Daniel himself. Sarah approached the bench with her son in her arms, the baby alert and content, clearly comfortable with the strangers around him, but instinctively turning toward his mother's familiar voice and scent. "This is the child in question?" Judge Morrison asked gently. "Yes, Your Honor. This is Daniel Jacob Thorne, born April 28th on our homestead in Park County." Judge Morrison studied the baby carefully, noting his obvious health and contentment. When Daniel smiled at the judicial attention, a milestone that had delighted the entire Thorne family just the week before, several people in the courtroom couldn't help but smile in return. "Mr. Worthington," the judge said, "would you approach the bench as well?" Edmund Worthington rose and walked forward, his expression carefully controlled, but somehow lacking the warmth that had characterized every interaction between Daniel and the Thornes. When he reached for the baby, Daniel immediately began to fuss, turning away from the stranger and reaching toward Sarah with clear distress. The baby's instinctive reaction spoke louder than any testimony could have. In that moment, it became clear to everyone in the courtroom that Daniel knew exactly who his real family was, and it wasn't the wealthy strangers who claimed legal rights to his future. The family photograph had been taken just 3 days before. Their departure for Cheyenne, capturing a moment of perfect unity that now served as the most powerful evidence they could present to the court. In the image, Jacob stood behind Sarah's chair with his hand resting protectively on her shoulder, while she held Daniel against her chest. Emma and Thomas flanked them on either side, their faces glowing with the kind of genuine happiness that couldn't be manufactured or faked. Judge Morrison examined the photograph carefully, taking in every detail. The way Emma's hand rested naturally on Sarah's arm, Thomas's proud smile as he showed off a wooden horse he'd carved himself, the obvious comfort and contentment in every family member's posture. When he passed it to the court clerk to be entered as evidence, Sarah saw him glance toward the Worthington table with an expression that suggested his decision was already forming. "Mr. Harrison," the judge said, "do you have additional witnesses to present?" "Yes, Your Honor. We call Emma Thorne to the stand." A murmur rippled through the courtroom as the 9-year-old girl walked forward with quiet dignity. Sarah had worried about subjecting Emma to the stress of testifying, but the little girl had insisted she wanted to speak for herself and her family. Now, watching Emma take the oath with solemn determination, Sarah felt proud of the young woman her daughter was becoming. Harrison's questions were gentle but direct, designed to let Emma tell her story in her own words. The little girl spoke clearly about her mother's death, her father's illness, and Sarah's arrival at their homestead. "Emma, can you tell the court what life was like before Sarah came to live with you? Papa was very sick, and Thomas and I were scared he was going to die like Mama did. We didn't have enough food, and everything was cold and sad." Emma's voice was steady, but filled with the memory of those dark days. "I tried to take care of everyone, but I was just a little girl, and I didn't know how to make Papa better." "And what changed when Sarah arrived?" Emma's face lit up with remembered joy. "She made Papa well again. She taught me how to cook real meals and how to keep the house warm. She held Thomas when he had bad dreams and told us stories that made us forget to be scared." The little girl paused, then added with simple conviction, "She became our mama." "Emma, do you understand that there are people who want to take Daniel away to live with a different family?" "Yes, sir, but that would be wrong." Emma's voice grew stronger, more determined. "Daniel belongs with us. He's our baby brother, and we love him. Those other people don't even know him." Blackwood's cross-examination was brief and unsuccessful. His attempts to suggest that Emma had been coached or that she didn't understand the situation only served to highlight the girl's natural intelligence and genuine emotions. When he tried to imply that the Worthingtons could provide better opportunities for all the children, Emma's response was devastating in its simplicity. "I don't want opportunities from people who want to steal my baby brother. I want to stay with my real family." Thomas was too young to testify formally, but Judge Morrison asked to speak with him briefly at the bench. The 5-year-old's innocent responses to gentle questions made it clear that he saw Sarah as his mother and Daniel as his beloved little brother. When asked what he would do if someone tried to take Daniel away, Thomas's answer brought tears to several eyes in the courtroom. "I would hide Daniel where the bad people couldn't find him, and I would tell Papa to make them go away." Daniel needs his mama and his family. The final witness was Mrs. Henderson, whose detailed observations of the Thorne family carried special weight because of her reputation for honesty and her 40 years of frontier experience. Her testimony painted a picture of a family that had been rebuilt through genuine affection and mutual support. "Judge Morrison, I've seen a lot of families in my time out here, some that worked and some that didn't. What I see in the Thorne household is real love, the kind that can't be bought or faked." Mrs. Henderson's weathered hands gestured toward Sarah and Jacob. "Those children were dying on the inside when their papa got sick. Sarah McKenna brought them back to life, and she did it through patience and kindness and the kind of daily devotion that only comes from a mother's heart. In your opinion, Mrs. Henderson, what would be the effect on these children if Daniel were removed from their home?" "It would destroy them, Your Honor. Not just losing the baby, but losing their faith that families can be trusted to stay together. Emma and Thomas have already lost one mother. Taking away the woman who saved them and the baby brother they adore would be a cruelty I can't even imagine." When the testimony concluded, Judge Morrison called for closing arguments. Blackwood's final plea focused on legal technicalities and the advantages the Worthington family could provide: education, social connections, financial security. His argument was polished and professional, but it felt cold and calculating in the face of the emotional testimony that had preceded it. Harrison's closing was simple and powerful. "Your Honor, this case comes down to a fundamental question. What makes a family? Is it blood and money and legal documents, or is it love and a choice and daily commitment to each other's welfare?" He gestured toward the family photograph on the evidence table. "That picture shows you a real family, not perfect, not wealthy, but bound together by something stronger than law or inheritance. Daniel Thorne was born into love, has been raised in love, and belongs with the people who chose to love him before. He even drew breath The Worthingtons speak of advantages they can provide, but what advantage is greater than being wanted for who you are rather than what you represent? What education is more valuable than learning that family means standing by each other through difficulty? What social connection is more important than the bond between a mother and child who chose each other? Harrison paused, letting his words sink in before delivering his final point. Your Honor, the law exists to protect families, not to destroy them. I ask you to recognize what anyone with eyes can see, that Daniel Thorne belongs with the Thorne family, where he has been loved since birth, and where he will continue to be cherished for his own sake, rather than for any inheritance he might represent. Judge Morrison declared a brief recess to consider his decision, leaving both sides to wait in tense anticipation. Sarah used the time to nurse Daniel, finding comfort in the familiar routine, while Jacob and the children stayed close beside her. Across the courtroom, the Worthingtons huddled with their lawyers, their expressions suggesting confidence in their legal position. When court reconvened, Judge Morrison's demeanor was serious, but not grim. This court has considered all evidence and testimony presented in the matter of Worthington versus Thorne. The question before me is not simply one of legal technicalities, but of what serves the best interests of the child in question. Sarah felt her heart racing as the judge continued. I find that the evidence presented by the petitioners contains significant inconsistencies and fabrications designed to strengthen their case through deception rather than truth. The altered marriage certificate, the distorted medical records, and the misrepresentation of Captain Thorne's military service all undermine the credibility of their claims. Worthington's face darkened with anger, but Judge Morrison continued without pause. More importantly, the evidence clearly shows that Daniel Thorne has been born into and raised within a loving family unit that was legally established through proper marriage proceedings in this territory. The testimony of community witnesses establishes the genuine nature of the relationships within this family. The judge picked up the family photograph, studying it once more. The law recognizes that Jacob Thorne is the legal father of this child, born to his wife, Sarah Thorne, on property owned by him in Park County, Wyoming Territory. The child's birth certificate, properly filed with territorial authorities, establishes these facts beyond dispute. Sarah felt tears starting to flow as she realized what Judge Morrison was saying. Beside her, Jacob's hand found hers and squeezed tightly. Furthermore, the testimony of Emma and Thomas Thorne, along with community witnesses, establishes that this family unit provides exactly the kind of stable, loving environment that serves a child's best interests. The obvious affection between all family members and the child's own response to his family versus strangers demonstrates clearly where his welfare lies. Judge Morrison's voice grew stronger as he reached his conclusion. Therefore, this court finds that Daniel Jacob Thorne is the legitimate son of Jacob and Sarah Thorne, properly born within their legal marriage, and that custody should remain with his parents. The petition by Edmund Worthington is denied in its entirety. The courtroom erupted in cheers from the gallery, where supporters from their community had come to witness the proceedings. Sarah felt overwhelming relief wash over her as Jacob pulled her into his arms, Daniel safely nestled between them. Emma and Thomas rushed to join the embrace, their faces glowing with joy and vindication. Furthermore, Judge Morrison continued, raising his voice to quiet the celebration, this court finds that the evidence presented by the petitioners contains sufficient fabrication and misrepresentation to warrant investigation by territorial authorities for potential fraud charges. Edmund Worthington's face had gone pale with rage and humiliation. As the judge formally closed the proceedings, he approached Sarah and Jacob with his lawyers trailing behind. "This isn't over," he said quietly, his voice carrying threat despite his legal defeat. "The Worthington family has resources you can't imagine. We'll find other ways to... Mr. Worthington, Judge Morrison's voice cut across the exchange. I would advise you to consider very carefully any future actions regarding this family. This court has just established their legal status conclusively, and any harassment or continued interference could result in additional legal consequences for you. With their legal victory secured and their family officially recognized, the Thorns gathered their belongings and prepared to leave the courthouse. The family photograph that had served as evidence was returned to them, and Sarah held it carefully as they walked toward the door. Outside, in the late afternoon sunshine of Cheyenne's main street, their small community of supporters gathered, around them with congratulations and expressions of joy. But for Sarah, the greatest celebration was simply walking toward their wagon with Jacob's arm around her, Emma and Thomas chattering excitedly about their victory, and Daniel sleeping peacefully in her arms. Ready to go home, Mrs. Thorne? Jacob asked, his voice warm with love and relief. More than ready, Sarah replied, looking at the faces of her family, the family she had chosen and who had chosen her in return. Let's go home. As their wagon rolled out of Cheyenne toward the mountains and the homestead that awaited them, Sarah felt a completeness she had never imagined possible. They had fought for their family and won, not through wealth or legal maneuvering, but through the simple truth of the love they shared. The battle was over. Their real life together could finally begin. The new rocking chair sat in the place of honor beside the kitchen window, its smooth oak surface glowing golden in the afternoon light that streamed across the homestead. Jacob had spent the entire winter crafting it with meticulous care, each curve designed to cradle Sarah perfectly, as she nursed their growing son or simply watched the children play in the yard. The chair represented everything their life had become, beautiful, functional, built to last, and created with love as its foundation. 1 year had passed since the legal victory in Cheyenne, and the Thorne family had settled into a rhythm of contentment that felt as natural as the changing seasons. Sarah sat in her rocking chair now, watching Daniel take his first tentative steps across the cabin floor toward Emma, who knelt with arms outstretched and encouraging words on her lips. "Come on, Danny," Emma coaxed, using the pet name she'd given her baby brother. "You can do it. Just a few more steps to Emma." Daniel, now 13 months old and determined to master this new skill, wobbled forward with the concentrated expression he wore for all important endeavors. His dark hair caught the light as he moved, and when he finally tumbled into Emma's waiting arms, his delighted squeal of triumph brought smiles to everyone in the room. "Did you see that, Mama Sarah?" Thomas called from his position by the fireplace, where he was carefully painting details on a wooden train he'd carved for Daniel's upcoming birthday. "Danny walked all the way across the room." "I saw every step," Sarah replied, her voice warm with pride and love. "He's getting so big and brave." Jacob emerged from the back room, where he'd been reviewing correspondence from his newest responsibility as Park County's sheriff, a position offered to him in recognition of his military service and standing in the community. The role suited him perfectly, allowing him to protect and serve while remaining close to his family and homestead. "What's all the excitement?" he asked, settling into his own chair beside Sarah's rocker. "Danny's walking like a real boy now," Emma announced, still holding her brother as he babbled happily and reached for her braids. "Pretty soon he'll be able to help with chores and learn to ride horses." The domestic scene filled Sarah with the deep satisfaction that had become her constant companion over the past year. This was the life she'd dreamed of without ever quite believing it could be real, a life built on mutual affection, shared responsibilities, and the kind of daily contentment that came from being genuinely valued for who she was rather than what she represented. The legal victory in Cheyenne had marked the end of external threats, but the beginning of internal growth. With the shadow of the Worthingtons finally lifted, each member of their family had flourished in ways that might not have been possible under the stress of uncertainty. Emma had grown into a capable young woman whose help with household management was invaluable, while her devotion to Daniel continued to amaze everyone who witnessed it. Thomas had overcome the last vestiges of the trauma that had marked his early years, becoming a confident, joyful child who approached each day with enthusiasm and curiosity. His protective instincts toward Daniel were fierce but gentle, and he'd appointed himself the baby's primary entertainer and teacher in the art of being a frontier boy. Jacob had evolved from the grieving widower Sarah had found dying in this very cabin into a man who carried himself with quiet confidence and deep contentment. His love for her had deepened through shared challenges, and their partnership had become the kind of equal relationship she'd never imagined possible during her years in Boston. "Sarah," Jacob said quietly, his hand reaching for hers as they watched their children play, "I've been thinking about something." "What kind of something?" she asked, noting the serious tone in his voice but feeling no anxiety. Over the past year, she'd learned that Jacob's serious conversations usually involved thoughtful planning rather than worrying problems. "The Henderson place is going up for sale. Old Mrs. Henderson wants to move to town to be closer to her daughter." Jacob's thumb traced across Sarah's knuckles in the gesture that had become as familiar as breathing. "It's good land, borders our property on the south, has a decent house and barn." Sarah studied his face, reading the possibility in his expression. "You're thinking about expanding. I'm thinking about the future. Daniel won't be the only baby in this family if I have anything to say about it, and Emma and Thomas are going to need their own homes someday." Jacob's smile was soft but certain. "I want to build something that can support all of them. Their children, maybe even grandchildren we haven't met yet." The vision he painted filled Sarah with warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling. In their hearth, a family compound, multiple generations working the same land, supporting each other. "Something like that. What do you think?" Sarah looked around their cabin, at the rocking chair that cradled her so perfectly, at the children who called her Mama with such natural affection, at the man who had offered her protection and discovered love in the process. "I think it sounds like exactly the kind of legacy Mary would have wanted you to build." The mention of Jacob's first wife held no sting anymore. Mary's memory had become part of their family's foundation rather than a barrier to their happiness. Her journal, still kept on the shelf beside their bed, served as guidance for child-rearing decisions and household management, while her love, letters to Jacob, had taught Sarah what devotion looked like when it was freely given and joyfully received. "There's something else," Jacob continued, his voice carrying a note of anticipation that made Sarah look at him more closely. "I've been corresponding with the territorial capital about the possibility of establishing a school district out here. With more families settling in the area, we're going to need better educational opportunities for the children." The idea excited Sarah immediately. What would that involve? Building a schoolhouse, hiring a teacher, probably serving on the school board to oversee operations. Jacob's expression grew thoughtful. "I was thinking you might be interested in the teaching position yourself." Sarah felt her heart skip with possibility. "Me, teach school." "You've been working with Emma and Thomas on their lessons for over a year now, and they've both advanced well beyond what I could have managed on my own. You have the education for it and the patience." Jacob's smile grew wider. "Plus, it would mean our children could get a proper education without leaving home." The prospect was thrilling. Sarah had always loved learning, and the idea of sharing that love with a new generation of frontier children felt like a perfect extension of the maternal role she'd grown into. "Do you really think I could do it?" "I think you could do anything you set your mind to," Jacob replied without hesitation. "Look what you've accomplished already. You saved a dying family, built a new life from nothing, stood up to powerful enemies and won. Teaching a handful of children their letters and numbers should be easy compared to all that." As if summoned by their conversation about the future, Daniel pulled himself up using the edge of Sarah's rocking chair and looked at her with bright, curious eyes. At 13 months, he was beginning to show signs of the personality that would define him. determined like his mother, steady like his father, charming like his big sister, and fearless like his big brother. "What do you think, little man?" Sarah asked, lifting him into her lap. "Should Mama teach school and help Papa build a bigger family home?" Daniel's response was a stream of babbling that sounded suspiciously like agreement, followed by an attempt to grab the silver locket that Emma wore proudly around her neck, Sarah's mother's necklace that had come to symbolize the passing of love from one generation to the next. "Careful, Danny," Emma laughed, gently redirecting his grasping hands. "That's a special necklace. Someday when you're bigger, I'll tell you all about the grandmama you never met and how her love came all the way from Boston to help build our family." The casual mention of Boston no longer carried any sting for Sarah. That part of her life felt like something that had happened to someone else. A frightened woman who had run into the night without knowing where she was going or what she might find. The woman she'd become, sitting in her handmade rocking chair, surrounded by the family she'd chosen and who had chosen her, bore little resemblance to the person she'd been before Jacob and the children had saved her from despair. "I want to do it," Sarah said suddenly, her decision crystallizing as she spoke. "The school, the expanded homestead, all of it. I want to build something lasting here." Jacob's smile lit up his entire face. "Then we'll start making plans tomorrow. But tonight, let's just enjoy what we have right now." As evening fell over their Wyoming homestead, the family gathered around the dinner table that Jacob had crafted during Sarah's pregnancy with Daniel. The conversation flowed naturally between practical discussions of daily life and dreams for the future, punctuated by Daniel's contributions in his own developing language and the easy laughter that marked a household where people genuinely enjoyed each other's company. After dinner, as they settled around the fireplace for evening stories, Sarah found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment of perfect contentment. The rocking chair that cradled her, the children who leaned against her knees to listen to Jacob's tales, the baby who dozed peacefully in her arms, all of it represented the kind of happiness she'd never dared to hope for during her years of marriage to Charles. "Tell us the story about the brave princess," Thomas requested, settling comfortably against Sarah's legs. "Which brave princess?" Jacob asked, though they all knew which story Thomas meant. "The one who saved the dying king and his children by being kind and strong," Emma said, joining the familiar game they played most evenings. "Ah, that story," Jacob said solemnly. "Well, once upon a time, there was a princess who didn't know. She was brave." As Jacob spun the familiar tale, their story, told as a fairy tale that made heroes of them all, Sarah felt the deep peace that came from being exactly where she belonged. Outside, Wyoming wind sang through the pine trees that surrounded their homestead, the same wind that had nearly frozen her the night she'd stumbled onto their property more than 2 years ago. Now that wind sounded like a lullaby, a promise of continued protection and the blessing of home. The wooden horse that Thomas still treasured sat on the mantelpiece beside Daniel's collection of carved animals, visible reminders of the healing that had taken place within these walls. But the truest testament to their family's strength wasn't in any object they could display. It was in the daily choice they made to love each other, support each other, and build a future worthy of the trust they'd placed in one another. As Jacob's story reached its familiar conclusion, and they all lived happily ever after in the house they built with love, Sarah looked around at the faces of her family and knew that some fairy tales really did come true. Not through magic or royal decree, but through the simple alchemy of people choosing to care for each other against all odds. The pregnant woman who had rescued a dying, widowed cowboy and his children, not knowing they'd become her family, had found something more precious than gold in these Wyoming mountains. She'd found home, she'd found love, she'd found herself. And that, Sarah knew as she rocked gently in her beautiful chair, with her sleeping son in her arms and her family's voices surrounding her with warmth, was the greatest treasure of all.